Thank you for joining us for this Japanese Embassy, Japan Embassy, Embassy of Japan to Italy sponsored event at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. I'm Giulio Pugliese. I wear multiple hats and I have the privilege of holding a hat here at IAI as a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific affairs. I will let Matteo Dian, associate professor in international relations at University of Bologna, do the honors as both discussant and chair, because Ken Endo was unfortunately unable to join us as a virtual chair, which would have made it even quite complicated, to be honest, to manage the discussions. But let me just give you a welcome to a very timely event on how the EU and Japan can cooperate security-wise in the aftermath of Russia's war in Ukraine. I'd start by simply pointing at a recent article by the Financial Times, which cited a leaked paper prepared for member states by the European External Action Service, which reads as follows. The EU must toughen up its attitude towards China and see the country as an all-out competitor with limited areas of potential engagement. The EU should work more closely with the US, strengthen its cyber and hybrid threat defenses, diversify its supply chains away from China, and deepen ties with other Indo-Pacific powers. And of course, one of the prime Indo-Pacific powers is Japan, that especially under the leadership of the late Abe Shinzo, has stepped up its security game. So without further ado, we will look forward to explore in this afternoon set of panels to how the European Union and Japan can exchange best practices specific to coercive behavior across the Eurasian landmass from one end to the other, and how can they cooperate or perhaps divide their labor in terms of security engagement in their respective neighborhoods. We have a very rich agenda that spans the whole rostrum of security engagement broadly defined, from traditional security, specific also to potentially nuclear deterrence, all the way to non-traditional hybrid threats, and also the securitization and potential spillover effects that emergent and disruptive technologies will have on our security environment, and then touch upon maritime security and also notably connectivity. And on that regard, we have a speaker from Tsukuba University who will join this panel in a second. And she is unfortunately going to join us in 10 to 15 minutes time. Atsuko Higashino, this is also so that the chair is well aware of the proceedings. And without further ado, I will pass the floor to Matteo Dian, who will introduce the speakers and give some rules, so to speak, to follow through this panel. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. It's delightful to see a full house, and I look forward to fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulio. Thank you for introducing the public session and this panel in particular. I will limit my remark here just to some basic rule. I will ask speakers to stay around 15 minutes, and then we will have question and answer. I will comment very briefly, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Let me just introduce the speakers. We have Liselotte Odgaard from Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, as Julie anticipated before, Atsugo Ikashino from Tsukuba University that will join us online, and to my left, Masashi Murano from Hudson Institute. Once again, it's a pleasure for me to be here chairing and commenting on this panel. The session is entitled Italy, Europe, and Japan Security Contribution to the Indo-Pacific. I will then leave the floor to Liselotte for the first.
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you for inviting me to speak at YAI. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I always learn a lot. I will talk about Europe's Indo-Pacific presence and whether it will last. So I'll adopt a critical point of view here, but I'm happy to take questions to my presentation in the Q&A. I will start by looking briefly at how other countries see Europe's contribution, and then I'll look at NATO's role, and then after that I will look at the EU and the member states, and finally I'll look at the prospects for cooperation between EU and Japan. So in 2021, the EU published a strategy on the Indo-Pacific, which had a lot of emphasis on security and defense, and the strategy was anchored in the ambition of democratic resilience, or to build democratic resilience. That strategy was welcomed by the US and also by the EU's Indo-Pacific partner countries. So whereas some years ago, especially in the US, we saw quite critical attitude towards the EU, that has gone away. And indeed, the recent US Indo-Pacific strategy and the national security strategy both recognizes the strategic value of an increasing role for the EU in the Indo-Pacific. And that role also, according to the US, should include tighter linkages between like-minded Indo-Pacific and European countries. Indo-Pacific powers such as Japan and South Korea and Singapore are also very interested in a European security and defense presence, partly because they welcome Europe's less confrontational approach with a greater emphasis on soft power, but also because Europe has a slightly more accommodating approach to China, which appeals to parts of the Indo-Pacific. The question then is not so much if Europe is welcome to have a role in the Indo-Pacific, I think, from its partners. The question is if Europe will be able to deliver on its intention to increase its Indo-Pacific engagement. And I think that is slightly more challenging. This question, of course, is not only about the European Union, but is closely tied in with NATO's approach to the Indo-Pacific and to China. So I'll start with NATO, because the US has promoted or argued that NATO should take on China for quite a while. And for the first time in the 22 version of NATO's strategy for the coming decade, its strategic concept, NATO has indeed taken on China as an actor that poses systemic challenges to Euro-Atlantic security. China is not defined as a threat that can trigger Article 5 collective defense obligations. So it's more defined like a challenge that NATO needs to act on and take seriously. The reason it's not a threat is that key NATO member states in Europe, such as France and Germany, are not yet prepared to put China on a par with Russia. But nevertheless, NATO members agree that the PRCs stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge the alliance's interests and its security and its values. And the alliance also defines the deepening Sino-Russian partnership and their attempt to undercut what is called the rules-based international order as efforts that run counter to the alliance's values and interests. And NATO is also determined to protect its members against the PRC's coercive tactics and efforts to divide alliance members. In meeting these challenges, NATO defines the EU as a unique and essential partner of NATO, which shares the values of the alliance. So while there has historically been some nagging between the two and lack of coordination and cooperation, as we've also seen in the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, NATO and the EU has moved much closer together and is much better able to work together, at least if there is a crisis. NATO also recognizes the value of a stronger and more capable European defense that can contribute positively to transatlantic, but also to global security. Because, as we know, threats from cyber, space, etc., cannot be confined to geographical spaces, and therefore security and defense is increasingly a global issue for everyone. NATO also recognizes the complementarity to NATO of EU's efforts, and that they need to work together to address the challenges. The Indo-Pacific is considered important for NATO, and that's because developments in that region can directly affect Euro-Atlantic security. For example, Chinese counter-space capabilities is obviously a threat to NATO, as they are to countries in the Indo-Pacific. As a result, the alliance will strengthen dialogue and cooperation with new and existing partners in the Indo-Pacific, according to the concept, and that is going to happen in order to tackle cross-regional challenges and shared security interests. The principal partners are Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. These allies differ from, or partners differ from, the other partners that NATO has. For example, if you look at a country such as Georgia, that is a country which NATO assists with modernizing its defense and its doctrines, and that will not happen with the Indo-Pacific partners. NATO also has partners that are more institutional and heavily integrated into NATO's deterrence and planning efforts. And that would cover the prospective alliance members, Finland and Sweden. So what kind of status does NATO's Indo-Pacific partners have? Well, they're first and foremost a function of decade-long relations built by the US, the EU, the UK, and also EU member states individually with countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. So it's not so much NATO itself that has built these relationships. They're standing on the shoulders of other actors. And NATO's Indo-Pacific partners are not strategic in the sense that they are expected to contribute to the alliance's military strategic concepts and plans, or strengthen its defenses. Instead, they are cooperative security partners, you could call it. And that signifies that NATO's going global is also a kind of conceptual enlargement process. So there will be coordination, there will be more dialogue, but they're not expected directly to contribute to the alliance's military strategic concepts and plans. The purpose of NATO's conceptual enlargement, as I would call it, is to strengthen the US commitment to the alliance, because they had long wanted to see NATO more engaged in the Indo-Pacific, and also to support European allies in defending themselves against Chinese security challenges. NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners can help each other with maritime domain awareness, anti-submarine warfare, patrol sharing, especially in the western parts of the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, which is as far away as most NATO member states are likely to operate on a regular basis. And this is even more pronounced with the growing threat from Russia. Nevertheless, this cooperation already takes place today, and NATO and Japan already have a long-standing record of working together as partners in providing capabilities and making security contributions in these areas. And this work is likely to continue. In addition, as mentioned before, the cyber and space challenges is an obvious area of cooperation between NATO and Japan, since they're both threatened by Chinese cyber and counter space capabilities, and NATO already has an array of instruments to deal with these challenges that could be extended to China now that China has been pronounced a security challenge. Although NATO is a useful partner for Japan because it has taken on China as a challenge, the EU's role in the Indo-Pacific is, of course, crucial, since it is mainly the EU which has been able to project European power into the Indo-Pacific. So the question is if the EU and individual member states are able to sustain and expand this effort. The EU already has a long-standing comprehensive civilian presence in the Indo-Pacific, and it's based on its status as a global economic power. It has built strategic partnerships with the same Indo-Pacific partners as the US. But the question is if the Union can translate its strong regional foothold into meaningful security and defense presence, as I would argue is required to be a key geopolitical actor in an increasingly militarized region. France has played a leading role in the development of a European defense presence in the Indo-Pacific, together with the UK as its most important partner. And for almost a decade, France has been successful in slowly mobilizing support for European presence, which has slowly but surely expanded with participation from a growing number of countries. Rather than being overt deterrence of China, the effort is more broadly intended to protect a rules-based security architecture through cooperation with and support for Indo-Pacific partners. As of late, Germany has joined the effort. They send a frigate, they deployed a frigate in the Indo-Pacific in 21-22 to conduct operations in support of freedom of navigation and exercise with the navies of Australia, Singapore, Japan, and the US. And this contribution, although small, was considered a key decision in forging French-German unity on a European Indo-Pacific defense presence, which arguably is a necessity to build a permanent and effective presence. And lately, the UK has also delivered significant contributions to Indo-Pacific defense. They deployed a carrier strike group in 21, and they have announced that they will deploy 2 warships in the Indo-Pacific permanently. However, with the Russian war in Ukraine, these efforts may be scaled down in future, both by the EU and individual states. Russia constitutes a pretty formidable threat, and the European Defense Facility has already, for now, I think, spent its money for capacity building and maritime missions on Ukraine. Then there's the Global Gateway Program, which has money intended for infrastructure projects, which is also relevant in the Indo-Pacific, but they are also likely to spend a lot of their funds in Ukraine. And even though the EU recognizes that its security is closely linked to Indo-Pacific security, I would argue that Europe is likely to concentrate on security and defense in its own neighborhood for the foreseeable future, especially as it's not only Ukraine that poses a problem, but the Balkans, Northern Africa, the Arctic is a concern in some areas, and the Baltic Sea. So there's a lot of jobs near to home, and it's hard to see how the EU can expand its Indo-Pacific effort in the current environment. If we look at individual European countries, the UK presence is no longer, as a matter of principle, an integral part of a European defense presence, even if the 21 carrier strike group did encompass European contributions, such as the Dutch frigate Evertsen. And you could indeed argue, that the UK presence signals London's support for the more confrontational military strategy towards China that is approved in Washington. And also, the UK's economic outlook becomes bleaker, and therefore hard choices will need to be made. The same is the case for France, where growing economic inequality inside the country and the center-periphery divide makes it hard to envisage that France continues to lead this effort and pay all that money for it. And Germany's commitment to boost defense spending is not likely to be spent on the Indo-Pacific. Then we have Italy, new government was very vocal, Meloni was very vocal on Taiwan, but we have yet to see if she's able to deliver on her critical comments about mainland China. So these caveats to Europe's future role as a significant geopolitical player are serious, but I don't think it means that Europe must admit defeat and cease to expand its Indo-Pacific security role. If you take the example of the EU and Japan, they have already established close coordination and consultation and recognized that security for the EU and the Indo-Pacific are inseparable. And Russia's war in Ukraine has strengthened EU-Japan ties. Japan has departed from its pro-Russian position and instead joined Europe and the US in adopting sanctions against Russia and provide assistance to Ukraine. Like Europe and the US, Japan is worried about China's support for Russia's war in Ukraine, and this also puts them closer together. The EU and Japan have similar goals of maintaining a free and open world order, and they're likely to continue to cooperate on defense training and exercise and on industrial cooperation, which is to ensure that they both remain at the forefront of high-tech in the defense and security area. They can help each other in the area of military technology. The EU has more soft power than hard power, can focus on civilian security cooperation together with Japan in areas such as disaster relief, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, which continues to be important priorities for the EU and Japan. And also, as the US emphasizes energy, health, food, climate, etc., which are also longstanding priorities of the EU, Japan, Brussels and Tokyo can cooperate more in these areas as well. For example, coordinating projects on infrastructure in Southeast Asia, where they both have a longstanding tradition of providing assistance, even if the funds will be more limited for the foreseeable future. So on that happy note, I'll say thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Liselotte. We have our second speaker that will intervene online, Atsuko Higashino from Tsukuba University. That should be now on our Zoom connection. Welcome, Atsuko.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me for this wonderful session. My name is Atsuko Higashino, and I'm a professor at University of Tsukuba. And I've been focusing on the external relationship of the EU for a long time. But these days, I've been focusing on the analysis of Ukraine war. And today, at this very precious occasion, I would like to talk about Japan-EU connectivity and its implication to Ukraine and its potential post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, in particular. So for this presentation, I would like to divide my presentation in two parts. The first part is that I'd like to briefly express how this war is regarded in Japan, how has the perspective in Japan has been changed, and how it is likely to be. So this is my first part. And second part, I will talk specifically about the EU-Japan connectivity and my kind of a very brief policy recommendation concerning that in order to revitalize this connectivity plan and how we can new impetus of this connectivity idea into the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. So let me start with the general Japanese evaluation of this war, which is going on at this moment. Okay, Japan has done unprecedented assistance towards Ukraine and unprecedented sanction to Russia. So it has to be a very huge change from the era of Abe. And many people say that I'm too critical to Abe's administration and its diplomacy, but I think Japan-Russia relationship had so negative aspect, so many negative aspects at the era of the Abe diplomacy. So it has got various problems, and that problems still remains in today's Japan, but still things are quite changing, I have to say. So recently, sorry about my voice, I'm kind of lost my voice these days. And recently, though, a change in tide in Japanese media coverage and people's perspective is quite evident, I think, and in a slightly negative way concerning this war. And I think this war has given a very, very strong shock to Japanese people at the time of the outbreak of this war. But this initial shock is kind of gone at this moment. And once again, it is started to be considered as if it is European war, not our war, not European, as European war, and as if we try to behave that this war is not, this war is nothing to do with Japan. So I think some people might criticize me to say that this is Japan is part of this war, but I think there's a very general tendency that many people prefer to stand outside of this war. But for example, I am very frequently asked whether Europe can survive this winter, could survive this energy price, could continue the assistance vis-a-vis Ukraine and continue military assistance towards Ukraine, and also could continue sanction vis-a-vis Russia. And I think Dr. Murano is going to talk about Taiwan issue from now. So I'm not talking about this Taiwan issue at the moment, but in the face of the crisis in Taiwan, even an argument is occurring that the US should save its assistance towards Ukraine and save it for Taiwan issue. So I think that there are general tendency in Japan saying that we shouldn't invest too much of energy into this war and save it to the next kind of crisis, which can happen in Taiwan. But I reiterate that Japan is part of the G7, and therefore Japan is responsible for sustaining this solidarity, and this kind of negative change in tide is not at all favorable. So today I would like to share you the very interesting survey, which is shared by rating group in Ukraine. This is issued by Ukraine rating group like several hours ago, and unfortunately we don't have Italy in here, but please do take a look at Japan one. We are still in a favorable position. For example, if you take a look at the ladder friendly and definitely friendly, it is like 55%. But if you take a look at neutral, it is 35%, and it is very much more than our European partners. So if you could simply compare these rates with the US, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, France, Switzerland, Germany, our rate of neutrality is considerable, even though we have got only 3% of negative opinion concerning the relations to Ukraine. So, and I will be coming back to China issue later on when I talk about the connectivity issue, but their rate is like 60. The rate of neutrality is like 63%. So, and we are already talking about how China is getting into the post-war reconstruction in Ukraine and also post-war reconstruction in Russia. So this high rate of neutrality would indicate that China will be very, very actively involving in both in Ukraine and both in Russia. So at the time of when we talk about the reconstruction, we obviously need to talk about how Japan and EU can take a partnership in this construction, but we do need to take care of China as they are trying to be very neutral. So I think their kind of intention is that they would like to be both in a key player in concerning reconstruction, both in Ukraine and Russia. Okay, let me come back to the my original talking point. Okay, so my second part is that Japan has provided so many assistance to Ukraine. So, for example, we provided Ukraine with drones, bulletproof vest, helmet, winter uniform and tent, etc. We have provided emergency humanitarian assistance of US 300 million and financial support of US dollar 600 million US dollar. And support, we have also provided the support for promotion of grain exports from Ukraine, which is our other duty of G7. And we offered visa extension of Ukraine residents to Japan and accepted evacuee from Ukraine into Japan. We also provided in-kind contribution and airlifting of UNHCR's humanitarian relief item by Japan Self-Defense Force aircraft. Also, we have made a very unprecedented sanction towards Russia. For example, we prevented financing to Russia from the leading multilateral financial institutions, including IMF, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And also, many people thought initially that it is not really possible for Japan to restrict transaction with Russian Central Bank, but we do at the moment. So this is a huge step towards the solidarity with EU countries and other than the US. And we do import sanctions that include freezing assets of persons and entities. And we revoked Russia's most favored nation status. And we prohibit imports from machinery, some wood, vodka, golden, etc. So many people thought that it is not really possible for Japan to pose this considerable sanction vis-a-vis Russia, but we continue to do so. But the stage and the level and the scope of the sanction is, of course, way smaller than that of the European Union. And the pace and the incentive that we put even wider sanction is like dwindling at this moment. So I think it is very important for Japan to see how we can widen the sanction hand in hand with the European Union. But I think this sort of discussion is kind of weakened these days. So in order to beef up the relationship between the EU and Japan in terms of its assistance vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Ukraine, I think it is really important for us to bring the new impetus to the idea of connectivity. The idea of connectivity, I'm talking about the partnership on sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure between the European Union and Japan, and which is signed by Abe administration and the European Union in September 2019. And I think the basic clause of this partnership is that Japan and the EU should work together on all dimensional connectivity, bilaterally and multilaterally, including digital, transport, energy, and people-to-people exchange. And for this connectivity, we do cover Western Balkan, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Indo-Pacific, as well as Africa, it says close to. So in terms of Eastern Europe, it is very specifically covered in this connectivity issue, but they are as a result. So this connectivity does cover Western Balkans, and it has some fruits in terms of the Western Balkans, in particular in Serbia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo, but not so much for Eastern Europe, in particular in Ukraine and particularly Georgia. So when we think about the this post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, I think we should revitalize this idea of connectivity and use that to post-war reconstruction. All right. The main idea for Japan and the EU was basically to face the challenge of China's Belt and Road Initiative together. I quote a very famous part of Abe's speech at the time of the inauguration of this connectivity. He said, whether it be a single road or single port, when the EU and Japan undertake something, we are able to build sustainable, comprehensive, and rule-based connectivity from the Indo-Pacific to the Western Balkan and Africa. This idea is still valid at the time of this speech, which is 2019, but it could be even more useful if you could add this the aspect that Japan and EU faced Russian challenge at the time of the reconstruction is Ukraine. For example, so in terms of the reconstruction roads and electricities and the heating system, I think this is very important. Very important idea can be brought from this very initiative. And the very important aspect of this connectivity is promoting rule-based connectivity. And this is something that Japan and EU can do together that China, as I mentioned before, cannot really do. So perhaps we should start with a memorandum of understanding between European Investment Bank and Japan International Cooperation Agency concerning this renewal aspect, and in order to adapt it to Ukraine. Sorry for my terrible voice. So this is maximum that I can speak today. So thank you so much, and so sorry for my poor health condition today.
Thank you very much, Atsuko. Now the next speaker is Masashi Murano from the Answer Institute, and therefore the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introductions, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm now living in Washington, D.C., but it is not hard to find the Higashino sensei's face in the Japanese media. So that is it is surprising for me that what I mean by this is that lots of, as the Professor Higashino clearly described, that a lot of Japanese people has pay attention to what's going on in Ukraine every day. This is because that they are concerned about the situation in Ukraine, and other European countries, including Poland and Italy, as a mirror image of the situation Japan may face in the future. So today I would like to talking about the similarities and the differences between the Russian's invasion of Ukraine and a possible future crisis in Taiwan, and what we need to consider as we deepen our cooperation and work cooperation. In the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, it was often explained in the Japanese media that it was surprise, but I had some slightly different perspective. Was it really a surprise for us? My answer is no. Because since the invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Western strategic community, including the allies, the U.S. allies, has conducted a number of tabletop exercises and the policy simulations that have focused on some scenarios. Russian re-invasion of the Baltic states or the Eastern Europe with nuclear blackmailing or actual limited nuclear use scenarios. In addition, the intelligence assessments of the Russian force laydown since the end of the last year and the timing of the start of the invasion have been almost exactly accurate. So of course, the attacks on the civilian targets in Ukraine and Putin's nuclear blackmailings are shocking for us, but it was not surprising. So in other words, the problem is not the failure to the anticipated to the invasion itself, but the problem is the failure to deter the invasion, even though that it was anticipated. So what is the cause of the failure to deter the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Of course, that there is no single factor, but it is hard to deny that defense resources for us, our defense resources has been insufficient for a long time. So one of the major examples, I'm in charge of the U.S.-Japan defense corporations, focus on how to collaborate with the Japan and the U.S. defense strategy. But looking back to the 2018 version, Trump administration's released that the national defense strategy has changed the U.S. force sizing construct to the one war standard after the determining that it would be difficult to maintain the traditional two major war standard in the age of the great power competition. At this point, a consensus was forming within the strategic community that the priority should be in the Indo-Pacific, specifically, more simply to say that focus on China. But it is undeniable that the risk of power vacuum in the European theater was underestimated at the cost of US focusing on the Indo-Pacific. Although after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I felt a little bit guilty, which means that also US allies in Asia, including Japan, also essentially welcomed the US concentration on the Indo-Pacific region. So in other words, the Russian invasion is the result that was inevitable because of we have overlooked the reality of our lack of defense resources and its portfolio. And also that the Biden administration's national security strategy, which released a couple of weeks ago, also stated that China is the only competitor with both the intent and the capabilities to shape the international order. Priority is given the Indo-Pacific. Yeah, I think still these, so that there is no change in the priorities, and also that I think it is reasonable. However, the resource constraint has not been resolved yet. And according to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, the fiscal year 2023 version defense budget request is up to the 8% from the last year, but it does not fully reflect on the inflation, so that which is actually flat or decreasing. So that's the fact. And so what I mean by this is, as long as the resource constraints continue, it is impossible for the United States to return to the traditional two major war standard against China and Russia simultaneously. However, this is not a first time it has faced such constraints. Looking back to the history, since the beginning of the Cold War, the conventional superiority or conventional balance in the NATO has always been maintained by the Soviet Union, so as a result, with the NATO relying on the forward deployed nuclear forces to supplement its shortfalls. However, today, the military balance between the Indo-Pacific and Europe is the reverse of that during the Cold War. What I mean by this is, in Europe, NATO has the conventional superiority, but in the Indo-Pacific region, China has this superiority in the theater range strike capabilities, especially for some medium-range missile capabilities and its inventory. And so that the primary way to compensate for these capability gaps is the United States and its allies, including Japan, to expanding their conventional forces or law enforcement capabilities to offsetting that imbalance at the gray zone level. But again, that is not easy job under the resource constraint situation. And recently, Japanese people have becoming concerned about the risk of the nuclear blackmail from China, similar to that of Russia is in a Taiwan crisis. That indeed that China's nuclear modernization is building that posture to be able to implement such on the escalate to de-escalate strategy like Russia. However, it is also important to note that there are differences in the strategic environments facing Russia and China. If that hypothesis apply on the case of the North Korean nuclear strategy, I think that it is reasonable. But Russia is inferior to the NATO and conventional forces. So therefore, they have a reason. They have an incentive to offset these imbalance at the conventional level, that inferiority by increasing the dependence on the nuclear weapons. It is reasonable. However, as I mentioned earlier, China is building the conventional superiority in the Indo-Pacific region. So in other words, it may be our side, means that the US side, not China's. So that will be forced to make a nuclear first use option. So this is the issue. This is a problem that has not been considered by the Japanese in terms of escalation risk. So indeed, that there is the strong nuclear taboo in Japan due to the tragic history of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But however, we can no longer continue to avoid these difficult policy arguments. And also that Europe and NATO have had more, by the contrast, the Europe and NATO has had more than 70 years to discussing these difficult nuclear issues. And when it comes to the nuclear issues that Japan placed to the particular emphasizing on the bilateral talks with United States, yes, that is important. But at the same time, Japan, or maybe in Taiwan, has more matter to needs to seriously learns what kind of the discussion in Europe has had with the US in the past. That is important, which means that I would like to emphasize on not only some consultation with the United States itself, but also we needed to exchange more our knowledge of our concern and what kind of way to apply onto to the some in the Cold War history or current environment against the Russia to the more deeper exchange, our consultation mechanism could be taking place between Japan and the NATO allies. And yeah, I stop here. That I can step into the detail about more other issues, but yeah, I would like to.
You have time. Another 5 minutes.
Oh, really? So yeah, so that if I can step into a little bit more another issues, another important factors includes logistics support. The fact that Ukraine has been fighting until today is largely due to the logistics support from the Western countries in the form of the weapons and ammunitions, which has kept Ukraine fighting for more than half years. So such support is possible because of the security or safety of the supply lines leading from the Poland, which is one of the kind of distribution center, and other neighboring countries, as well as from the western part of Ukraine to the eastern part of Ukraine. However, it is not easy to provide these kind of same stable logistics support to Taiwan. Taiwan has only a few large ports on its eastern coast, and the PLA, the People Liberation Army, can quickly predict which port supply vessel will enter. So besides that, in order to ensure that the safe passage of the Western supplies to Taiwan, that we needed to ensure that the air and the sea air and the maritime superiority surrounding Taiwan. However, the Taiwan Strait is already covered by the PLA's coastal air defense systems. So, and the eastern side will be similarly covered by the KJ-500. It's a Chinese version of AWACS, and the Luyan class destroyer. It's a kind of Chinese version of the Aegis destroyer. Those systems could be provided covered of the air defense of the eastern side of the Taiwan. So what I mean by this is that to break, if China has tried to conduct it to the maritime or aerial blockade surrounding Taiwan, the providing to stable logistical support to Taiwan, it will likely to be essential to strike against Chinese mainland. So there are two problems here. The first, will the US political leadership authorize on the attack on the mainland China? The second, will we be able to quickly deploy the sufficient assets that could carry on such an operation? It means that neutralizing the Chinese coastal, the air defense systems, or the Luyan class destroyers, or their AWACS. The first, I'm skeptic that now it's at least the Biden administration actually concerned about the nuclear escalation or further escalation between Russia. Of course, we can say that Taiwan is not a Ukraine. Even Japan is the official allies of the United States. But at the same time, that when we confront with the nuclear armed adversaries, that we have the same risk to escalate the nuclear war. So how to manage those kind of risk? So that is one of the major issues. And the second point if U.S. political leaderships has the willingness to conduct it to those kind of offensive operation against Chinese mainland, we don't have some sufficient asset to carry on those kind of operation because of their air defense system has been sophisticated now, so that the assets will be which can be able to those kind of operation has been very limited. Stealth bombers, but how many stealth bombers US has, and where does they deploy now? Also, that another option is the precision long-range strike missiles, but how many number of the US missiles has been deployed in this region? 0. So that now is the problem is if we need to think about this, even China still has limited their capability to the maritime transport capabilities to directly invade Taiwan, but they may be able to choose some another option like a blockade or distant blockade, so on. But if they conducted to those kind of blockade operations, at the same time we still have some operational difficulties. So that at that time, what kind of roles we needed to think about to breaking out those blockade without, I think that without is very difficult, but how to avoid or minimize or control the further escalations. So that's my current interest, focus on what we should be needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Masashi. Thank you all our speakers for very insightful presentations. In my role of discussant, I will take a few minutes to ask a few questions and try to find some common points for our discussion. On the first two presentations by Liselotte and Atsuro, well, look, we can sum up that probably the EU and Japan are realizing, as ever before, how much we share in terms of the liberal international order and the solidity and the cohesion of the norms underpinning them. And therefore, we can surely think that that is a important progress. Both presentations highlighted how much we can work, how many sectors can see more cooperation, how many technical areas from patrol, ISR, space, cyber, technology, there are many. So there is a lot of potential for expansion. It seems to me as well that there are also other critical points in terms of importance. The capacity to maintain the political consensus for this kind of cooperation, which is not necessarily in terms of how visible these things are politically and how costly they are, but also in terms of capacity to absorb and offset the costs of conflict or the cost of being tough on a potential adversary when the crisis manifests itself. So maybe that is one of those other areas that we have to look at. And surely both presentations already told us something in terms of this challenge, maintaining a firm behavior and policy in those terms when the cost presents itself. We mentioned energy costs associated with the sanctions to Ukraine, just to make an example. So those are surely important points. The other point that I think is particularly significant is how we see and how we treat Russia and China. Surely we see on this side of the world, Russia is more a direct threat. For Japan, China is more a direct threat. And in those terms, having a policy in the past that saw to some sort of cooperation and even diplomatic breakthrough was saw under the Abe government, it was also a way to try to detach China from Russia. Now that is an important concern. If we treat them as a monolith, we enable even more the cooperation between the two. And that is a really complicated scenario. Therefore, probably another point in the list should be, how can we seek to promote the liberal international order, but also find a way to wedge China and Russia. Because this is something that I think Japan has articulated even more than the European Union, more clearly. The fact that if those two cooperate and are cohesive against us, we are an even bigger problem. The third and final point would be, how can this vision of European-Japanese cooperation attract other partners? So we are all working in a framework of what we can call a network security architecture. So it's not monolithic, it's user-friendly. We cooperate in different areas at different times, in different moments, with partners with different levels of intensity of preferences, with very different capabilities and different levels of technologies. And it's great, I think, is the way forward. How can we do this attracting other partners? Partners that match a lot. India, a number of actors in Southeast Asia, just to mention a few. How can we bring them in without contributing to a potential risk, which is the polarization of the international system, not just along strategic lines, but also along ideological lines. So it's definitely complicated, since we want to underline the commonality of our interests, but especially of our values, but also attracting others is very, very important. I think these themes are sort of crucial for everyone. A couple of things specific to Masashi's presentation that I found very insightful, and there was a lot of strategic issues involved. I was wondering, and this will be an maybe overly pessimistic in a very dark environment. Can it be that China can learn maybe the wrong lesson from Ukraine, seeing that potentially a conflict, yes, large scale, but remained a proxy conflict, remained something where you can limit vertical and horizontal escalation, therefore you can limit the involvement of great power versus the neighbor. The others are cooperating, are fully helping, providing weapons and all the rest, but both sides maintain the level of escalation to a certain level and not before, not beyond that. How can we deal with that in terms of deterring future conflicts? Because if you want to send a strong signal, the first thing that you do is say, no, look, this will escalate to a level that is not acceptable. It turns out that for as bad as it is in Ukraine, it arrived to a level of escalation that seems to be acceptable in a cost calculation. So how can we alter that? Final point will be probably, as academic, I love theory of all this. We should go back to look to stability and stability paradox, right? We have kind of stability at the higher level. So when we talk about deterring with nuclear weapons, yes, surely, and it's crucial, but that is not a silver bullet. Still, we have to do, as you underlined partially, do deterrence at the lower levels. So in terms of missiles, in terms of hybrid, in terms of localized conflict, and then it becomes more complicated. And then I wonder whether bringing nuclear weapons in can even further complicate the calculation. So of course, the nuclear part is crucial, but maybe doesn't solve everything. And also going back to the history of Euro missiles in Europe, that was incredibly complicated. Maybe solved a lot of problems, but it took like 10 years to figure out how to fix it. And it ended with negotiations with the other side, by the way. So I think that is a fascinating scenario to look at, and we really have to make a number of efforts to calibrate our policies and our answers. Thank you very much. I will ask you maybe if you want to comment on my remarks, and then we open up to the floor for questions.
Shall I start?
Yes. Please.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. You raised the issue of how to maintain political consensus and absorb and offset the costs of being tough, as I also did in my presentation. And I think these issues are very serious problems. And you asked how to get more countries on board in this EU-Japan cooperation. I think I'd like to start or answer these difficult questions by looking at China's response to NATO's new strategic concept and to EU's effort, which I've had a chance to debate with them over the past few months, as in the PLA. And my sense is they're not worried about NATO at all, for good reason, because as I said, NATO has an ambition to go global, but it will remain mainly sort of a conceptual, be in the dialogue where the EU is in there. I don't think China envisages NATO in itself as a big threat. But what is of concern to China is all the networking that's established between various partners, the EU, NATO, the US, France, India, South Korea, and the cooperation that happens across a very wide range of issues, such as industrial policy, cyber threats, China's counter space capabilities, economic security, which is very much stressed in the US national security strategy as well. This is what worries China. And I think that is also where we're actually much stronger than we sometimes think. I was deployed, the French Foreign Ministry invited me to be deployed on their carrier a couple of years ago for about 5 weeks, which is a very long time. So I was there from Goa to Singapore, and that was under Trump in 19. And it was very interesting to see actually how seamless and well, for me, who worked for many years in defense, and I know it doesn't always work well with these corporations. So I was surprised to see how well France cooperated with the US as the backbone in this mission, worked with various partners, India, Japan, Australia, sometimes bilaterally, sometimes trilaterally. They hadn't been in this environment with the carrier for decades, and I can tell you that matters a lot. But still, cooperation was actually very effective. And we have all these base sharing agreements that matters a lot. So, a lot of people always say, oh, France is they're a residential power in the Indo-Pacific, but they're small, they don't matter, blah, blah, blah. They just said, yes, they do matter, because they have base sharing agreements with Indo-Pacific countries, and this is very important. And so there's this networking, and this, especially as economic and civilian security issues and hard security issues are very integrated today. It's very important that the EU and NATO has overlapping partners with the US, and they exchange information, best practices. That may sound like an excuse for doing nothing, but it actually isn't. It's very important. And this, to my mind, is what China is worried about and what we should be happy about. And I don't think this effort is as vulnerable to public opinion and lack of resources. Of course, maybe we cannot send as many frigates then to conduct freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea as we would have liked for the next decade, but we can still do a lot of these things, I believe, at a reasonable cost. And I think those efforts to help each other in cyber space and base sharing and all these things, there are actually lots of countries on board in the Indo-Pacific, and I think this is hugely important. And that's why China worries about these agreements. So that would kind of, China-Russia, I agree. I mean, China has really been caught out in Ukraine. They hate that war, and that also tells us that they cannot tell Russia what to do, obviously. That being said, China will not want to be caught out in this situation where they might face sanctions if they don't lie low on cooperating with Russia. They don't want to be in that situation again. So we talk about we want to decouple. Well, China wants to decouple from us too. And they're trying to use the global south for that purpose. They're sending strong signals that they hope they can maintain cooperative relations with Europe still. And they're still hoping for that, although they're not doing well. And I think Europe should take that opportunity, but they should do it with care, because in our near abroad, Russian cooperation with China continues and will continue because China does have an interest, for example, in Russia being able to continue to threaten NATO, for example, in the Arctic, the Baltic Sea region. And they can help them do that by economic and technological help that is not necessarily easily detectable, but that means a lot to Russia. So just, it's not an easy relationship to navigate at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In terms of costs, I don't really think that the main issue is the cost, and because in terms of this EU-Japan connectivity partnership, the issue is not that Japan is finding a lot of difficulty finding adequate finance, but it is about finding a very good project for the EU and Japan to do together in the framework of this connectivity. And when we had a talk concerning this issue with the people in MOFA, they are not concerning that as for the Western Balkans, they can have a lot of issues concerning the treatment of the nuclear plants and also the climate issues, etc. And I think they are kind of running out of idea of what to do with the EU, because I'm talking specifically about the problem from the side of Japan is that Western Balkan is already very much covered by the European Union, and the European Union doesn't really show necessarily that they would like to do this and that together with Japan. So the finding the issue in common in itself is very difficult. This is my impression. So rather than the issue of cost, I think it is purely about the issue concerning the point of cooperation. What kind of point of cooperation can be done together with Japan and the EU. And I think, again, it is about the political will from the side of Japan, because I think it is widely shared within MOFA and the NATO institutes that this initiative it's in any case initiative by other and not necessarily followed by his predecessor. So I think it is such a pity if this very well elaborated project is largely considered as a pet item of Prime Minister Abe. So I think taking off all these sort of the political sort of prejudice concerning this the birth of this project and how this project can continue to develop, I think it is very important to take the nuts and bolts of that and to try to put the substance in that, and attracting partner beyond EU and Japan. I think it is a very good point. But even though I think at the time that just as I said before, Japan and the EU has got a lot of difficulty doing something together in this connectivity framework. I think we should be in a position that we first consolidate what we have to do within this framework, and then would like to find other partnership, including the US, just as they do in the 3C initiative, for example, and taking that initiative into the in order to boost up this Japan initiative. So bringing in the US is very important, and at the same time, other non-European countries like Switzerland and Norway is also very, very important, because they has got a very good expertise concerning the assistance to Ukraine. So thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you very much for your questions. The first one is, what does China learn from the Russian-Ukraine war? It is difficult to answer that at this moment, because of it depends on how this war ends. So it may not be a direct answer of your questions, but in the Western military experts community has the consensus, which is that to maximizing the operational or strategic advantage of the Chinese side, the short, sharp war, or Chinese version of the blitzkrieg, is one of the most efficient way to attacking Taiwan. But at the same time, as I already mentioned, that if China once China's failed of those kind of short, sharp war, even though that they have the chance to the distant blockade options, and then when we face those kind of situation, it is very difficult to defeat their blockade. So anyway, so that the point is that even they choose that the proxy war, that we needed to find some solution to how to keep that our logistical support. So in that context, I think that a couple of the important things is here. The one is the pre-positioning, also to confirm our capabilities of those kind of external logistical support in some contingencies happens. So at that point, I think that we can learn from the history in Europe and the NATO in the Cold War. So when in the Cold War era, the NATO has regularly conducted on the reforger exercises. So reforger is the acronym of the return the force to the Germany. So it's a kind of some testing and confirming of the lack of the capability of the mobilization and their logistical support, the problems. They are constantly checking on that every year. So that but Japan's self-defense forces have sometimes conducted on those kind of mobilization exercises inside of Japan, but we've never conducted on the jointly with the United States forces in the Western Pacific region. Even though also that we've never had those kind of exercises with Taiwan forces. So I think that I can understand that some political obstacles to involved with the actual Taiwanese forces, or in the track 1.5 level or track 2 level. Well, that is one of the role or the responsibility of the think tank community to try to conduct it on those kind of tabletop exercises, invite with some retired general is those 3 countries, or asking to some knowledge from the European countries. That is my suggestion to how to reinforce our mindset. Second point, stability instability paradox. This is the main field to dealing with that, so that I can talk about the more than 1 hour. But so that first that yes, this is one of the major concerns to the Japanese security communities, and how to solve this problem is one of the most difficult challenge for us. And also that in this spring, that I will. I've published some policy paper from the Pacific Forum to deal with if U.S. government acknowledge of the mutual vulnerability with China, how Japan react, or what's Japan faced with some of those concerns. One of the major concerns is the stability instability paradox, and so that what kind of situations happened in this situation? So that we have some couple of scenario. One is the political acknowledgement by the U.S. government that this is. I think that this is bad choice. We don't need to give the free tickets or wrong confidence to China. They can dissuade the U.S. nuclear employment when some contingencies happens. But even though that we need to recognize and we need to understand that it is not just a problem of the political statement. Those situations backed up to the actual capabilities. So what I mean by this is that we cannot stop the Chinese military modernization, includes the nuclear modernization, and as we know that they has already started to to building the more than 300 ICBM silos. So these facts, it is a matter of time. So these facts will be very challenging for our security environment to how to avoid the instability paradox has occurred in this region. So as I mentioned in my initial presentation, that the straightforward way to offset this kind of the gap is that to reinforce our conventional or law enforcement forces. But again, it is not an easy job for us. So that it's related a little bit related to some previous discussion. At this moment, Japanese government and the U.S. government has conducted on the independent threat assessment and the independent force development and the capability development. Under the resource constraint situation, I think that it is luxury, but we cannot maintain those. We cannot live in those luxury anymore. So what I mean by this is also another lesson learned the experience of the NATO allies to conduct it to the joint or shared threat assessment and the smart defense concept like the shared capability development is one of the key elements to how to offset it more effectively to coordinate it with our conventional defense portfolio. So that's my current thought.
Thank you very much for the answers. Do we have questions from the floor? I think we have a microphone to circulate down there if someone wants to break the ice over there.
Thank you to the panel. My name is Teresa Fallon. I'm with the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. And I have a question for Dr. Odgaard. You said that China hates this war. How do you know that?
Do we want to answer this directly or? Yeah, okay.
Of course, I don't have a way of lie detecting what I'm saying, but I do think that China feels very much sold out. They're walking a fine line between wanting to still appear as, a power that respects the rules, that's committed to the UN system, that will help Ukraine, and that's not, supporting an invasion of word, and then maintaining their strategic relationship or partnership with Russia, which I think is very important to them for a number of reasons, not least their interest in Russia being able to help them create strategic dilemmas for NATO in Europe. So for that reason, and because the Ukraine war has sort of been tied in with the Taiwan situation by the US and putting pressure on China, I think they are that's the last thing they needed. I think to me, that's very convincing when you look at the response. They didn't really know which feet to stand on, and also the threat of secondary sanctions if they did not respect the sanctions. Clearly, they have tried to, avoid giving military assistance to Russia to reach those sanctions because they didn't want to be hit by them. So that's another serious problem that kind of, ruins their game. And I think maybe worst of all, it damages their relationship to Europe. And Europe is still a very important source of high-tech, intellectual property, etc. There's still a problem there. We have dealt with it. And they don't like to lose that position. And they don't like to lose. They're still economically, they're dependent on trade with the West. And Europe is important in that game as well. So, but they have realized they're going to have to look for other partners. So they're stressing very much the global South now these days, but it's not something that's desirable for China to have to, take those choices right now where they have loads of domestic economic challenges. Well, so that would be
Great answer. Any other question from the floor? I would ask Julie. Julie, if you want to intervene? Okay, yeah.
A quick follow-up then to you. You said we must think of ways to drive a wedge in the Russia-China relationship, but haven't they been trying to do that since 2014? And it hasn't proven successful. So isn't this kind of, shouldn't we maybe come up with a different strategy?
Well, I don't know, but I think it's been unsuccessful, maybe in a certain extent, but the fact that China sees the war in those problematic terms that she articulated before, and I pretty much agree with, is maybe a testament to the fact that that strategy has bear some fruit, meaning that China has sided with Russia, but not completely, not surely providing the same extent of help the West has provided to Ukraine. And therefore, maybe we should continue. And in any other sense, pushing them together even more, I think it will be problematic in the long term. And on the other side, Russia is in a particularly problematic situation now, being isolated from the rest of the world and entering in a situation of subordination in a very one-sided relationship with China. So I think there is space in the longer term, not in the short term, to try to minimize the degree in which the two cooperate. And again, I see that this is not fully articulated in the European Union. It's much more articulated in Japan as probably a strategic necessity looking forward. Julia?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'll a very brief question to Liselotte. This goes actually back to also what Professor Higashino said concerning Japan's support to our efforts in Ukraine and then kind of like punishing Russia's invasion of Ukraine by following through with sanctions. Some sanctions, of course, have been deferred because, of course, by, if I'm not mistaken, not blocking investment in Nord Stream 2, the Sakhalin, the gas pipeline, China would have occupied the space. So that makes sense for Japan. What do you think is the feasibility of the European Union member states, of not necessarily the Union in itself, but this might fall under the purview of the European Union in enforcing sanctions against China and the invasion of Taiwan? Do you think that's a possibility? Of course, it's contextual and specific to who changes the status quo and whether, of course, there is an action-reaction dynamics that kind of like make space for a heavy militarized crisis scenario. But in the case that it's unequivocally a military crisis of China's making, Or do you think that the European Union and European players would actually follow through on sanctions? And before you actually answer a hypothetical scenario question, a question for Masashi. I've learned a lot, and I am conscious that Japan is in fact installing, along with the US, short and medium range missiles armed with conventional, of course, warheads. And what is interesting is that this is part and parcel also of a changed approach in Japan's acquisition of these capabilities. That is that they would target, of course, also, they would aim at counter-strike capabilities, as the saying goes. What is interesting is that the targets are also command and control in China, which is not necessarily understood by Japanese public opinion, because that entails a potential fallout away from pure military targets. It might entail civilian targets, and this contradiction between Japan's acquisition of offensive capabilities and the inability to explain it to its own people, which retains still strongly an anti-militarist sentiment, is this going to then be a hard sell if push comes to shove when Japan has to use these capabilities? If I'm not mistaken, even US missiles had to be stationed in Okinawan Islands, closer to Taiwan, on the account that military exercises should be repeated. So there was this kind of legitimization process that kind of like really was a facade that tries to legitimize the enduring presence of this US missiles, not talking about the Japanese, on the basis of a continuation of military exercises into the future, which is much more cost-effective to keep them. And I emphasize this because I see as a potential vulnus in Japan's acquisition of offensive capabilities along with the US, the inability to spend them because of public opinion, of an anti-militarist public opinion, of this global survey on values by Pew, according to which only 13% or less of Japanese respondents would be willing to fight for their own country. Still, even in these dangerous times, there is still this strong allergy in Japan. Isn't that a potential weak point if push comes to shove? And then a very hard question. On the basis of all this, why talk of nuclear sharing as late Abe did, precisely at the time when the Japanese government was acquiring these counter-strike capabilities? This adds the anti-militarist allergy to the nuclear allergy. And it was going to be a hard sell to get these counter-strike capabilities. And at the very same moment when Japan was enshrining these new capabilities and doctrine of force posture, it was talking about nuclear sharing. I mean, at least late Abe and some more conservative members of the LDP were. So it didn't make strategic sense, perhaps. So I'm sorry, this is probably very hard questions, but thank you very much.
Do you want to respond to this directly?
Yeah, I can try, although it's probably really a question for you officials in the audience. But I'll start by saying, I think that no one wants a war in the Taiwan Strait. China doesn't want a war. No, thank you. I don't think the US wants a war either, and Taiwan certainly doesn't. So, and to be frank, I think this is probably one of the most orchestrated theaters in the world because no one wants a war. Of course, we don't hear about that, but I'm pretty sure they tell each other what they're doing before they're doing to a large extent, to precisely because they don't want a war by accident. And so if sort of military conflict were to break out, I doubt, it's not certain that you can very clearly say this was the mainland who attacked Taiwan. In which case, the EU, I guess, will be left with a not very nice scenario. But in such a scenario, but so will the US. I mean, that's a very hard question to answer, but I don't think the EU is happy about the whole situation, because the US really is, they're putting a lot of pressure on mainland China with regard to Taiwan, because they see this as the moment where they can ensure that Taiwan stays on democratic hands and therefore remain our de facto partner and ally, even if it's not in principle. And to do that, the US has chosen this sort of confrontational strategy, which China feels they're forced to respond to that. So that permanently leaves us at a higher tension level, which is always dangerous. So I think the whole situation is something the EU is not very happy with, because they risk being caught, entrapped, as you call it, in a conflict that they really don't agree on the way it's perceived as it is. But so the question of sanctions is very difficult to answer, given that I think this is the situation. But if anyone from the EU wants to enlighten us, we're happy to hear it, I'm sure. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Julio. That is one of the another essential question about how Japan and US to coordinate with the not just the capability itself, also but the Japanese, the complex, their own feelings about that. Yeah, I can explain that a couple of angles of this issue, but at first, I would like to mention about one of the major differences between the form of the policy or operational consultation mechanism between US-Japan alliance and other major alliance. NATO and US ROK alliance has the single integrated command structure. In case of NATO, that the NATO commander is the US general, force generals, and also the US ROK alliance, they have combined the force command to in some contingencies happens. Now it's also even it's a very controversial between the US ROK government, but at this moment, at least, they agreed with if some contingencies happens, that the CFC commander will be controlled, which means that the US Force of Korea's that commander controlled the whole operational authority at the area of responsibility inside of the Korean Peninsula. But unlike NATO and the US ROK alliance, the US-Japan alliance does not have the single integrated command structure. They have a bilateral command structure with the US commanders and the Japanese commanders and coordinating each other. But even though we don't have it's kind of NATO-like joint targeting coordination board, because of one of the major reasons is Japan has not had our own long-range strike capabilities. It means that we don't need to think about seriously our offensive strike operations with how to control the risk of escalations. But even if we hosted some US conventional ground-based missiles, this is one of the will be essential problems, because of without targeting coordination and prioritizing which target is going to be more important, that if it's case of the contingencies with China or the North Korea, those missile arsenals has almost integrated with the nuclear and conventional, so that their missiles, the most part of North Korean and the Chinese missiles are dual capable. Even Japan will not be able to obtain to strike capability against time-sensitive target like a mobile missile itself. That their command and control structures or the sensor facilities or sensor capability has linked to some nuclear and conventional, the both. So it's called the entanglement problems. So what I mean by this is even without US ground-based missiles, the US F-35B at the Iwakuni or US forward deployed F-22 has conducted on some strike operation in China or Korean Peninsula. We've already had those risks to escalate to the nuclear level. So why we don't have those kind of targeting coordination mechanism? So I'm positive to host if US ask us to deploy their conventional ground-based missiles. From the context of the capability itself, that it is positive for us. But under the conditions that Japan can involve the decision-making and the policy planning and the targeting coordination mechanism, this is essential. If US does not allow to Japan involved those targeting coordination or operational planning process, I cannot support and I cannot explain to the Japanese public why we need to host the US ground-based missiles, even it's conventional. So it's related on the nuclear sharing issues. That the nuclear sharing is a very special or unique form of the consultation under some unique situation in the Cold War and the Cold War technologies, so that I'm not positive to apply the whole of this mechanism. It's in NATO to US allies in Asia. But before that, starting to talking about those difficult nuclear issues, that we need to start in talking about the conventional operational coordination with US-Japan alliance, so that that's my kind of thought. It's one of the stepping stone to the upgrading of our consultation, operational consultation mechanism.
Thank you. I think we are, Giulio, we are running out of time. Or do you have any? Yeah, so we can close the session. Okay, so we have time for another question. If you can raise your hand and please keep it short since we are almost running out of time. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Question for Mr. Murano. Is there a connection between the Kuril Island issue and the Japanese siding with the West in the war in Ukraine?
Well, I don't think so. It means that some part of the media commentators, it is not the Higashino sensei, but some media commentators or some conservative politicians sometimes mentioned about it. Now is that now is a chance to taking back the Kuril Islands when Russian focused on the Ukraine. Yeah, military can say maybe it's true, but I think that it is not feasible to taking back to some that's territorial or to solve the territorial dispute. Also that that is the one of it is a little bit hard to say that, but to be honest, that it is the one of the most of the Japanese people has already realized that the negotiation process had not been worked, even the personal relationship between the Prime Minister Abe and the Putins. So now there is a more realistic, so that it is not a chance to solve the territorial dispute with Russia. So.
Thank you very much. If I can close with a super short note, I didn't mean before when I said exploiting the fact that there are divergence of interest and perception between China and Russia, I didn't mean cooperating with Russia in the short term, because maybe that came out a bit unclear for me before. Any other very quick question? No, otherwise I will thank you all. And we have now a coffee break, and we reconvene at 4:30 for the second session. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. On a very warm day, I'm delighted to see you still here for an excellent panel on the triangulation between EU, Japan, and NATO. It's absolutely wonderful to be back in Rome. Thank you to Julio Pugliese for the invitation. And IAI, I was in Rome a year ago, so for the G20 for a side event, and it was far less crowded than it is now. So it was really nice to be in Italy and Rome at that time. Also, a shout out to Alessia Amigini, who had invited me to an event here in Rome for her book launch, and we had to do it online. So I'm just so honored and delighted to actually be here physically today. So let me introduce our panel. I'm really honored to be on the panel because I've lived in Brussels altogether 18 years. I know that's hard to believe. I lived in Japan, and I was also the part of the Strategic Advisors Group at NATO for a short period of time for General Breedlove, who was the Supreme Allied Commander. So I'm really looking forward to the panelists' introduction. So I'm going to start with Marianne Perron-Doise of IRIS. Her presentation is on law enforcement at sea and soft balancing in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
May I?
Oh, please.
So, Mike, thank you. So thank you, Madam Chair, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me here at Rome for the IIE. I'm going to talk about law enforcement at sea, meaning that this will lead me to talk about the Coast Guard and the growing role of the Coast Guard in the region in maintaining what is described as good order at sea. And it so happens that Japan has developed a specific approach for several years in this field, which consists in reinforcing the role of Coast Guard in the Southeast Asian countries in order to help them to defend not only their maritime borders and maritime boundaries, but also their blue economy against growing illegal activities at sea, meaning illegal fishing, smuggling of weapons, immigration. And this is what is described generally as the Japan Coast Guard diplomacy. And what is interesting is that the EU has adopted more or less the same approach, which aims to strengthen regional maritime capacity by addressing in priority the Coast Guard and maritime agency, whether in the Southeast Asia or in the Indian Ocean. And this is done through the Primario project, which is a maritime capacity building program to help regional Coast Guard to protect their blue economy. So it is therefore a project that is more or less linked to development and what I would describe as a soft security approach. And this makes it possible to characterize the European and Japanese approach in the Indo-Pacific area as a kind of soft balancing policy, even though we are witnessing a hardening of maritime claims, which means that the Coast Guard are faced with a very, very tense situation at sea. And in the same way, the Coast Guard force tend to become more militarized. The units become more and more powerful, they become bigger, and they have progressively more military equipment, more armament. And it is also, as you can guess, getting more difficult, more dangerous for the regional Coast Guard, for the littoral state, to maintain good order at sea because of the multiplication of tension in the South China Sea, of course, but also in the East China Sea, where the Japanese Coast Guard are confronted with very aggressive Chinese counterparts around the Senkaku Island. And moreover, these Chinese Coast Guard are often accompanied by large flotilla of fishing boats, which they escort, which they protect, particularly in contested area, not to mention the presence of maritime militia, which act as a kind of suppletive to the Coast Guard, or for that matter, to the PLA Navy. The multiplication of this state and non-state actor has led to a situation known as a gray zone situation, and we will come back on that. I will briefly develop 4 points in my presentation to emphasize precisely the importance of law enforcement at sea and assess the trend regarding this specific force in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, I will introduce something quite obvious, the maritime geography of the Indo-Pacific, and of course, the strong maritime security dimension. I will develop what is the new division between the role of traditional navies and police force or maritime agency, Coast Guard. I will touch upon the rise and the development of Coast Guard in Southeast Asia, which are more and more presented as defender of the maritime border and blue economy, and how this Coast Guard are developing a kind of specific regional cooperation. And of course, I will finish by coming back on the point of the gray zone situation and how the situation is getting tense for the Coast Guard in the whole Southeast Asian area. So coming on my first point, of course, Indo-Pacific is essentially a maritime geography. You may remember that describing the region in 2007, in a very famous address to the Indian Parliament, Shinzo Abe, who was then the Prime Minister of Japan, spoke of the confluence of the two seas, meaning the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And looking at a map, of course, we can see how the Indo-Pacific is a very vast body of water. Within its center, the South China Sea, which appeared to be a kind of maritime corridor and an irreplaceable passageway to link these two these two major maritime basins, Indian Ocean and Pacific, that form the geography of the Indo-Pacific. And it is therefore very easy to understand the importance of the problem linked to freedom of navigation, safety of navigation, and not only in the whole region to link the littoral state to each other, but also to allow them to trade with each other and, of course, with the rest of the world. In a global perspective, this helps to understand the strategic importance of a secure and free access to the South China Sea for all. And this is the most evident result of maritime globalization and growing importance of maritime transport for the global economy. So the Indo-Pacific is really the engine of growth for the whole planet, thanks to its main sea lane of communication. The traffic in this very strategic Strait of Malacca has doubled in 10 years, for example, and this explains why piracy in this area became a very pressing issue for the international community. In this context, the security of the access route to the South China Sea and the safety of navigation is really an issue, while it is also necessary to deal with a whole range of many diverse criminal activities at sea. I already mentioned illegal fishing, but also potential maritime terrorism, human trafficking of all sorts, migration, weapon trafficking, and not to forget impact of climate change in the whole region. And this element has pushed the coastal state to create or reinforce the maritime police or Coast Guard and to put in place monitoring tools for securing their maritime domain, notably their EEZ, their economic exclusive zone. One can mention the creation of an information fusion center in Singapore in 2009 to facilitate precisely the exchange of maritime information in the region and to increase regional cooperation. Another element that pushed countries as Vietnam, Philippines, or Indonesia to give more attention to the law enforcement force is China's tendency to use its Coast Guard to support its claims. In a nutshell, Coast Guard are an important asset for the maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. Their role is largely tied to law enforcement, policing territorial water, keeping them safe from illegal activities and criminal actors. Recently, Coast Guard have started to take on more expanded role, not only in Southeast Asia, but also in East Asia. And this is due in particular to the increasingly aggressive posture of China maritime forces in the South China Sea, but also around the Senkaku Island, disputed with Japan. Let me turn now to the division of role between traditional navies and maritime police force. The geopolitical readjustment underway in the Indo-Pacific region pose a real challenge to traditional navies and also conventional naval operation based on deterrence and power projection because of the growing role of maritime agencies charged with policing and law enforcement mission. For navies, the return of power rivalries, particularly between the United States and China, has put a premium on protection, on projection mission and offensive capabilities in the event of a potential confrontation at sea. However, many maritime trade are based on the proliferation of criminal activities, and this mission has contributed to the unprecedented importance of civilian actors in the maintenance of good order at sea, such as Coast Guard, who are perceived as the kind of new defender of state sovereignty in support of navies. In certain cases of tension on maritime borders, such as I already mentioned, the South China Sea, a kind of strategic and operational continuity has haven't been established between the two components. So the traditional distinction between the defense of maritime sovereignty and the policing, environmental protection and rescue operation of navies and government maritime agency, respectively, is becoming blurred. The imperative of defending sovereignty as a sovereign right of state at sea, especially its economic right, means that Navy and Coast Guard force increasingly have similar mission and similar role, which explain much of the growth of Coast Guard fleets in Southeast Asia. States such as Philippines, Vietnam, which did not have Coast Guard and placed little emphasis on state capacity building mission at sea, have established and equipped that Coast Guard as a matter of priority, particularly with the active support of Japan. And these forces fight themselves on the front line in the context of interstate station, where it is not a question of protecting the maritime sovereignty of the state or its economic rights, but in a posture of contestation and claim against rival Coast Guard. And this quasi-belligerent posture is reflected in the development of heavily armed, large tonnage Coast Guard vessels, particularly in East Asia, where the Chinese example have led to the militarization of government maritime agencies. One have observed a rise in the development of Coast Guard force in the Indo-Pacific due to their usefulness in dealing with new type of maritime security concern. And this is quite visible in the western part of the Indian Ocean, where sovereignty claims on maritime boundary are complex, navies are smaller in size, about those of China, of course, and tension at sea are increasing. In this maritime environment, coastal states have bestowed Coast Guard with new duties on top of their traditional one, to be responder deployed in more sensitive missions, which often occur in dispute maritime territories. As a result, we can observe more interaction between Coast Guards and navies in this water, while law enforcement activity and the protection of good order at sea were becoming more and more difficult, more and more dangerous because of serious risk of collision with Chinese Coast Guard. In the South China Sea, and I will develop this point. The Southeast Asian forces, the Coast Guard of Southeast Asia, are emerging as a guardian of maritime border and guardian of the blue economy. The increasing complexity of the Asian maritime environment has resulted in a significant increase in naval equipment expenditure over the last 10 years. The newly created Coast Guard in Southeast Asian states have benefited from this dynamic, which has enabled the modernization and reinforcement of regional resources in terms of coastal surveillance radar and patrol boat. Piracy, which has been rampant since beginning of 2000, and maritime terrorism, two recurring threats that particularly affect the Singapore Strait and the Zulu and Sulawesi Sea, remain at the forefront of regional concern. Securing the Strait of Malacca and Singapore has largely mobilized the capability of littoral navy, but also, you remember, the international community. And this has been compounded by the hardening of territorial claim of the main state involved in dispute over the Spratly and Paracels in the South China Sea, and the resultant regional competition for the exploitation of maritime resources, that is to say, the control of the blue economy, and the aggressiveness of Chinese fishing fleet and paramilitary forces operating in the disputed area has led to an increase in incident at sea. And in this context, the littoral coast guard are positioned themselves as interface that signal a consent to avoid the systematic use of force in unexpected encounter at sea in order to keep the intruder within the bounds of proportionate action, if possible. And this consent to control the level of tension at sea is accompanied by a regional cooperation effort that is largely relayed by or support by external maritime actors, including the United States and Japan, who are concerned to maintain stability and transparency at sea in the face of Chinese bellicosity. The EU has also joined regional maritime capacity building by deploying its regional maritime domain awareness support program called CRIMARIO in the South and Southeast Asia. It offers a maritime information exchange platform, IORIS, to the Coast Guard Agency in the Philippines and Indonesia. Relation has been established with the Fusion Center in Singapore. Coordination is already active with an actor such as the UNODC in the zone, which has been developing law enforcement program in the area for a long time, as well as the US Navy. And closer ties and coordination between all these actors could avoid duplication of effort and send a strong strategic message to the country of Southeast Asia, which sometimes can feel a little alone in face of their Chinese neighbor. I understand that I am short of time, Teresa. I can't believe it. Okay, and so in fact, I just wanted to finish by insisting on the fact that Coast Guard are develop a kind of maritime cooperation, quite active in the region, and are at the origin of the creation of some mechanism to increase the maritime domain awareness. I already mentioned the Information Fusion Center of Singapore, but I can also recap the regional agreement for combating piracy and armed robbery against ship at sea. And of course, I would like to mention a specific initiative of Japan, which is AGAM, which is the head of ASEAN Coast Guard Agency meeting, which is developed since 2004, and which remains the most recognized tool to organize regional cooperation between partners in order to combat ASEAN piracy, but which is progressively extending its scope to law enforcement, precisely maritime safety, disaster prevention, and capacity building. And I want to finish by mentioning that US come recently by offering a diverse initiative in order to increase this maritime domain awareness and maybe to soften the role of the Coast Guard of the littoral state. I have in mind the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness System, which have been proposed through this mechanism of dialogue and cooperation called the quadrilateral, gathering India, I already mentioned Japan, US, and Australia. And of course, this could be very well welcomed by the region as adding new capacity. But in fact, some countries are a bit reluctant, you see, to accept to take part to this new initiative, which are very, I will say, in the limb actually, because they are afraid of, I will say, increasing the polarization, which is already existing in the region. And I will stop there, and I'm sorry if I...
No, thank you for that very rich introduction. I want all of you to think of questions for her later on during this panel. So the habits of cooperation, maritime domain awareness, Primario, and especially the Japanese contribution of Agam. I think that's wonderful. So I'm going to move on to the next speaker, Mark Ozawa from the NATO Defense College. He will be speaking about NATO's strategic concept and Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the organizers and to Giulio in particular for the invitation to join you today. I'm actually based in Rome, but I woke up this morning feeling a bit under the weather, thought it would be best to stay here, but I'm happy that I can join you virtually, at least, to participate in the discussion. As was mentioned, I'm a researcher at the NATO Defense College. I've been at the college now for about 4 years, and my area of focus is NATO's eastern flank, Russia, sort of post-Soviet space, and also the northern flank. So it's been a busy past year. Before I get into this, into the topic of my presentation today, just want to give the usual disclaimer that these are my views and not those of the NATO Defense College or of NATO policy. So with that being said, I'm going to say a few words, my views on the topic of NATO's strategic concept, the new strategic concept that came out this year at the Madrid summit, and also implications for NATO Japan cooperation. Realize I probably don't need to explain this to this audience, but it's worth reminding that Japan is a partner of NATO. It's in the group of partners across the globe, which is one of the 3 main partnership categories. But Japan also has a tailored partnership with NATO that focuses on interoperability. And it's also worth mentioning that at the NATO Defense College, we're happy to also receive students from Japan, and we do have students from Japan every year. So that's one tangible experience that I have with the partnership. So that being said, I think some of the points that I'll mention today have already been touched on by other speakers in the previous panels, but I'll try to go over those more quickly. And just an acknowledgement to the chair, since I'm not there, please feel free to interject when I'm coming close to time and let me know. I'll try to be cognizant of time though. So it was already mentioned that Japan is the only G7 country that is not a member of NATO. But NATO and Japan's interests, in my view, are becoming more aligned, particularly this year, driven by the war in Ukraine, implications for security developments in the Indo-Pacific, and NATO's rising concerns over China. My assessment of the new strategic concept that I'll be presenting is based on my own reading of the document, but also in the context of discussions that I've had with officials at NATO headquarters, and at the college, we contributed to the NATO 2030 reflection process in the lead up to the Madrid summit. So also can perhaps provide some context to some of the points in the strategic concept. All right. So the first point that struck me about the new strategic concept, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but here it is printed out. I thought it would be useful to also compare it to the printed out version of the last strategic concept, which came out in 2010. And they say don't judge a book by its cover, but in this case, it's very clear that NATO is reaching out more to the public and is paying more attention in its efforts with this strategic concept to transparency, engagement with the public, and outreach. Compared to the last strategic concept, I thought that this strategic concept was also much more forward-looking rather than looking to the past of 9/11, and even in the 2010 strategic concept, there were references to the ongoing fallout of the Cold War. The strategic concept tells you about NATO's perception of its security environment. It also signals to adversaries and partners and to the world at large what NATO has planned for the future. It's an aspirational document. And it also tells you something about, I think it's also an exercise in establishing and reaffirming NATO's identity as a values-based military alliance. Overall, when I compared the two documents, I mentioned that the previous security concept had a focus more on terrorism, followed of the Cold War, 9/11, and there was an emphasis on sort of continuation of what NATO does and continuous improvement. Whereas the 2022 strategic document is much more forward-looking. There's no mention of, no references to the Cold War. It does reference significantly shifting geopolitical forces, and there's a sense of an uncertain future and a need to prepare for that. But at the same time, the new strategic concept is in some ways a sort of back to the future type of document, insofar as there are lots of parallels to Cold War posturing and an emphasis on conventional military threats. There's also, you can see this shift to conventional military threats in this shift from what NATO refers to as a shift from a forward presence to a forward defense on NATO's eastern flank. And this means to me a shift in strategy from one of deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial, which is more expensive, requires significantly more resources. In the 2010 document, Russia was still a partner. Technically, it is still a partner, but in the 2010 document, Russia is described as being a partner with like-minded security concerns and areas of cooperation between NATO and Russia in stability and fighting terrorism. And the foundation of NATO and Russian relations was still the NATO-Russia Founding Act, established in 1997. Now, however, Russia is viewed in the new strategic concept as the #1 threat to security. And there's no mention of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. NATO's policy of engagement with Russia, this dual track approach, on the one hand, deterrence and defense, but on the other hand, dialogue and a degree of cooperation, it's still implicit in the new strategic concept. So NATO is still leaving the door open to a degree of communication, particularly with respect to risk reduction and also arms proliferation. But the dual track approach is not mentioned explicitly. The other significant development in the new strategic concept that is relevant for this discussion is that China is now mentioned, and it is mentioned as a challenge. In the 2010 document, this was also brought up earlier, there was little on topics of human security, but human security, climate change, energy security, and particularly the Women, Peace and Security Initiative are very much showcased in the new strategic concepts. In the last security concept, you got a sense that NATO was still very much, in its view, focused on geographically the transatlantic space, whereas the new strategic concept is much more global in view. However, the nuclear deterrent remains the foundation of NATO's deterrence in both documents. In 2010, there was more of an emphasis on equal burden sharing and getting all of the allies to sort of toe their weight. In the new strategic concept, that seems like it's a given, that it's understood by the allies. Another interesting difference is that the EU is very much showcased as, I would say, NATO's primary partner, primary institutional partner. Less so is the UN, whereas in the 2010 document, that order was reversed. And my final sort of observation about the two strategic concepts, I could go on for a while on this, but I think in relation to today's topic, I got a sense from the previous strategic concept from 2010 that there was an assumption that we had reached this sort of end of history moment, that was still continuing on from the 1990s, a higher degree of certainty about the future. But the 2022 strategic concept seems to me much more of a call to arms to defend in a very uncertain and emerging security environment. So now I'm going to shift slightly to points of potential cooperation between NATO and Japan, drawing from the new strategic concept and also from other observations and discussions. There are a few points that are worth mentioning. The first one I see in my notes I already did mention, but it's worth repeating. Ukraine, China, and also the deepening Russia-China relationship. These are creating more of a convergence of interests between NATO and Japan. Worth mentioning that NATO and Japan do have a long history of cooperation going back to the 1990s, but in the past, the interests were not as aligned as they are now. For those of you who have worked on NATO issues before, This will be familiar, and those of you who have not, just bear with me one moment. So strategically, and this is included in both the 2010 and the 2022 strategic concept, NATO has 3 core tasks, and in order, you might say, of priority. The first is deterrence and defense. The second is crisis prevention and management. And the third is cooperative security. Now, I mention this because partnerships were showcased in the 2010 strategic concept in just one of the 3 core tasks, in the third task. But in the new strategic concept, partnerships are showcased in 2 of the 3 core tasks, in crisis prevention and management and cooperative security. In the new strategic concept, Japan is also singled out as a key partner, along with Finland and Sweden, which may be joining NATO soon, the ROK, Australia, and New Zealand. And of course, I mentioned the EU. And if you've been following current events recently, there are, I think, obvious signs of growing cooperation between NATO and Japan. Some of these points were already mentioned today, but it's worth mentioning again. Prime Minister Kishida's attendance and taking part in the Madrid summit. I've noticed that Secretary General Stoltenberg has been mentioning Japan more often in his press conferences over the last months. Japan is also standing with Ukraine in not only politically, but in tangible ways. Those points were already mentioned in terms of non-lethal support, accepting Ukrainian refugees, and certainly implementing sanctions against Russia, something that hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think was also a strong signal seen within NATO and I imagine within the EU. But when the issue of energy security first came up in the discussions leading up to EU sanctions of Russian coal and oil, Japan, along with Australia, were the first partners to announce that they would divert some of their LNG supplies to Europe in support of refilling gas storage in preparation for the winter months. And at that time, Nord Stream had not been cut off yet, but there was still a sense that there could be supply disruption. So that was, I think, a strong signal. For Japan, NATO is a forum to engage, not only with NATO itself, but also with members of NATO that Japan may not have a strong sort of bilateral communication line about security and defense issues. And that's also very useful for Japan. Exceptions, of course, are the US and perhaps the UK. It was mentioned, I believe in the last panel, the importance of networking, and NATO is certainly a forum for networking for Japan. NATO is, as was also mentioned before, a standard-setting organization. It's been very successful in setting standards, and this is useful for Japan, particularly with respect to interoperability. Japan has this this capability and has had good experiences with the US. But it could advance in terms of interoperability with other allies. How am I doing on time? Okay, so it might also be worth mentioning. It was a Taiwan scenario was brought up in the previous panel, and there are some tangible ways. If that scenario came to fruition. Hope it doesn't, but hope that many things didn't happen this year that have happened. NATO could provide, and particularly allies, could provide some support in cyber support, logistics support, command and control communications, and intelligence sharing. This was a point brought up in the first panel, Chatham House. I won't attribute, but I thought it was a very astute point, something that we're seeing can be a type of deterrence by disclosure tactic that we're observing in Ukraine, and of course through sanctions.
Okay,
I think that, yes.
Maybe you can wind it up in the next few minutes. It's been very rich, but we want to try to keep.
Yes, of course. A lot has already been said about the maritime domain. I won't touch on that. I guess maybe I'll end with just one final thought. I came to the NATO Defense College about 4 years ago, and shortly thereafter, there was a Japanese delegation that came to visit us to discuss the prospects of greater cooperation. And as a scientific team and education organization, we were perhaps more at liberty to imagine scenarios and discuss different possibilities. But among my colleagues, it was difficult to imagine that there would be greater cooperation between NATO and Japan in the near future. That has changed, and not just this year because of Ukraine, already beginning a couple of years ago. And I forget who said this in the previous panel, but I do also observe in my discussions within various NATO entities that there has been a change in the mood and the ambiance about partnerships, and particularly with respect to Japan. One of the major obstacles that I think is worth mentioning about practical cooperation with Japan is the classification wall. Having said that, the sharing of intelligence, to have a real conversation. Having said that, NATO did face a similar obstacle with the EU some years ago, but has found a way to overcome that. And that could be a model to overcome that obstacle in interactions with Japan. So I'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions and the next presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I hope you feel better. And I think that living in Brussels for so long, NATO and the EU were like two elephants in one city, and they never talked to each other. So we've really come a long way. And I think that is inspiring hope for everybody. Especially, I noticed during the Trump years, Japan played a key role in communicating what was happening in the Asia Pacific to NATO. So they really stepped up, and I think they provided a lot of valuable information. I mean, I think he made some interesting points about shifting geopolitical forces and the uncertain future, deterrence by denial rather than punishment. And I also attended the event in Brussels when Shinzo Abe came to meet with President Juncker to ink an agreement on infrastructure projects. That didn't go very far. So let's hope this time in a rebranded gateway project that we will see real progress. It's really important. So I will move on to the next speaker, Tomoko Nagasako of Sasakawa. She will be online, and she will be speaking about the alteration of disinformation, lessons from the war in Ukraine to the crisis in East Asia. Thank you.
Thank you for kind introduction. So good day, everyone. I'm Tomoko Nagasako, a research fellow in the Department of Security Study Program in the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Thank you very much for inviting me to such meaningful webinar, and I am honored to be participating in these interesting discussions. So as my expertise are cybersecurity and information warfare. So today I would like to give the presentation regarding the alteration of disinformation from information warfare to cognitive warfare, and then lessons from the war in Ukraine to the crisis in East Asia, at last, I would like to explore the cooperation point between EU, Japan, and NATO. So, firstly, I'd like to confirm the position of information warfare and cognitive warfare. The definition of information and cognitive warfare should be reviewed, I believe. Starting in the 20s, 20 minutes. Starting in the 2010s, the human cognitive domain began to be established as a new operational domain in the US military. In information warfare, cyber attacks are the important key tools. So, as you can see in this slide, there are 3 types of cyber attacks: information manipulating cyber attack, data stealing cyber attack, and destructive cyber attack. So, and traditionally, these operational domains are land, sea, and air, but these days emerging new operational domains are space, electromagnetic wave, and cyberspace, I think. And a very new one is the human cognitive space. So, however, as I mentioned, in these emerging operational domains, cyber attacks are very key tools, but however, it is not just cyber warfare, but also cognitive warfare, because these cyber attacks, especially information manipulating cyber attacks, is aiming our cognition. And in these operations, influence operations and disinformation static narratives, such tools and operations are used by some malicious nations. And in these operations, influence operations and so on, sometimes no cyber operations are used. For example, using internet media, not traditional media like newspapers or televisions. So these are the overview of new operational domain. And then, okay, so let's move on to the overview of information warfare in Ukraine war. So this figure based on the article written by the member of NATO CCDCOA. So according to this article, under information warfare, there are 3 layers and operations: inform and influence operations, IIOs, and influence cyber operations, ICOs, and information operations, IOs. So these operations are targeting both sides of non-Bayesian countries and Bayesian countries. So if I apply this concept to the Ukraine war, the slide shows the situation. So inform and influence operations starts from the peacetime to the armed conflicts wartime. However, information operations are started mainly in wartime, sometimes from the gray zone time. So so these definitions are as followings. So inform and influence operations is inform and influence operations are efforts to inform, influence, or persuade selected audiences, actions, utterances, signals, or messages. And influence cyber operations, influence cyber operations are operations which affect the logical layer of cyberspace with the intention of influence attitudes, behaviors, or decisions of target audiences. So these operations are very close connections with cyber tools. And information operations is integrated employment during military operations of information-related capabilities in concert with other lines of operations to influence, disrupt, corrupt, or usurp the decision-making of adversaries and potentially adversaries while protecting its own. So inform and influence operations are targeting broadly, including the international opinions, but contradictorily, information operations are targeting more narrowly, comparing the inform and influence operations. So they are targeting mainly military and intelligence communities. So cognitive warfare is one element of information warfare. And then, as I mentioned in the first slide, disinformation is one of the tools of influence operations in information and cognitive warfare. And next, I would like to review the actual example of Ukraine war. So these are disinformation cases in Ukraine war. In the top left, information that Zelensky had fled the country was circulated from the Russian side, but Zelensky combated such disinformation by continuing to post images of himself on social networking sites from the presidential office almost every day. In the top right pictures, this image was manipulated by Russia to to make it look as if Zelensky was a neo-Nazi. Russia claims that the Ukrainian government was controlled by neo-Nazis and spread disinformation to support this narrative. And in the bottom left, this pics describes shortly before the invasion, information was distributed that Russian troops had completed exercises and retreated from the Ukrainian border area. But this was denied by several intelligence disclosures, mainly from the United States, as you know. So this type of disinformation is a type of information operations which are explained in the previous slide. And this is aiming mainly military and intelligence community of Ukraine and supporting nation to Ukraine. And also, Ukraine also uses this information to make international public opinions their allies. The Ukrainian border guard, one of example is a picture in the right bottom. The Ukrainian border guard Zminy Island garrison was reported to have been spectacularly crushed, partially, but in fact, all were captured and survived. The phrase, which is considered to be their last message, last message, pack of Russian ships, became an anti-war slogan and provoked anti-war rallies in many countries. I think this is a kind of type of making narratives, I think. So later, I would like to explain the definition of battle of narrative and the strategic narratives. So, okay, so let's move on to the definition of disinformation. So under the information warfare, these words and the terms are very confusingly and ambiguously. So I would like to check the definition of disinformation and narratives in the following slide. So, disinformation is one of the operations of the information warfare and false and or manipulated information aimed at attacking society and the public interest. A mixture of truth, falsehood, and ideally a confusing of both. So please be careful of that. Disinformation is totally different from the fake news. So disinformation includes sometimes includes truth and correct information, but the context is manipulated and changed misleadings. So these misleading elements affect damage our public interest. So, and it does not operate only in wartime, but also in peacetime, such as elections or referendums. And this figure shows cases of arrest meddling in elections and other democratic processes since 2016. When the use of the disinformation operation to meddle in elections started to draw attention. In this slide, I would like to emphasize disinformation is operated also in the peacetime. Information warfare does not have the border between wartime and peacetime. The national decision is once damaged by any influence operations, even if it happens in peacetime, and then it is equal to the violence of sovereignty, I believe. And then I would like to check the concept of narratives. So narrative is very broad terms, also used by the sociology or some literature sciences. But in this national security context, narrative is more than merely a story, but an explanation of events in line with ideology, theory, or belief, and one that points the way to future actions of adversary nations. It must follow a story-like structure and affects our cognition. And NATO provides some years ago in their report, the concepts of narrative arc. Narrative arcs are consists of the four situations. Firstly, the problem or conflict happened, and then it caused a desire to solve it, and it leads a series of actions, and it leads a resolution, happy ending. in case of Taiwan, this event took place during a visit to Taiwan by the Speaker of the House of Representatives Pelosi in August. A group of Chinese hackers hacked digital signage in convenience stores and train stations in Taiwan and replaced it with images that gave the impression that Pelosi was a war mongering, which in response to these developments, President Tsai Ing-wen has expressed concern in recent years about China's war of cognition, referring to Ukraine. And I believe the authoritarian states that must be confronted urgently for democratic nations at the present are mainly Russia and China. They have national strategic concepts of cognitive warfare as this slide. Also, Russia adopted the term in the post-war period and China didn't begin using until the 2000s. The abyss of these concepts are historically long-standing. Also, these details differ. What these concepts have in common is intention to attack the cognitive domains of the decision makers, soldiers, and citizens of other countries, and to make their actions favorable to our country. I guess NATO has already researched Russia's strategy well in this present, but I think China's strategy is somehow ambiguous for EU or NATO's maybe. So today we have the time limitation. I skipped this slide, but if I have any questions, I would like to present this slide in the question time. So I would like to move on to the issues as national security of information warfare and cognitive warfare. So for countermeasures of information and cognitive warfare, long-term measures are needed against information warfare from peacetime to gray zone and wartime. Manipulating our political decision and our cognition is the crisis of democracy. Information warfare, especially cognitive warfare, is a very new area, and legislation to counter it is lagging behind so much. And for Japan, conflicts with freedom of expression and secrecy of communication is a war to combat the information warfare. So finally, I would like to discuss the cooperation between the EU and Japan and NATO. So the EU has accumulated much in the combat against Russia since the post-war period, while Japan lags behind in intelligence and cyber capabilities. However, because Japan is facing Chinese expansion in the ASEAN region and is adjacent to Taiwan, there may be information that can be shared with the EU, to EU by Japan, I believe. To do so, Japan must improve its attribution and intelligence capabilities further. So, under this situation, I think these points, information sharing and rule making and human resource exchanging networking, is a cooperation point between the EU, NATO, and Japan, I think. And finally, I would like to pose a question. So can Japan enter in and cooperate on the narrative arc of EU and NATO? Also, we have a different culture or different cultural legislation, but I believe liberal democracy is a common core concept. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a brilliant presentation. I think it really helped everyone understand. It was very comprehensive. And I was thinking, I've never seen that poster of Zelensky and the Nazi shirt. So that's one I hadn't seen before. And I think that maybe this will come up during the Q&A period, but this idea of how China is actually magnifying Russian disinformation through all their information channels. So they're offering them a lot of rhetorical support we've seen throughout the world, even though some see some sort of rift between Russia and China. I haven't seen it yet myself, but and we have to remember that when the war began in Ukraine, we saw this incredible thing that went around Weibo saying NATO owes China a blood debt from the bombing of the embassy in Serbia. And I thought, can that be true that it's 1 billion likes? But it's been around for a while. And I thought 1 billion likes, that's huge. You know, China's a huge population that's been floating around on their internet for a while. But then I saw Harry Styles had 5 billion likes. So I guess that put things into perspective. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for your excellent presentations. And now the discussant will be Lorenzo Termine from La Sapienza University of Rome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Teresa, for your introduction, and thank you, Giulio, for inviting me today and making me this great honor of discussing these great presentations by Marianne, Mark, and Tomoko. I will follow the same order, and I'm sorry because I'm not an expert into so many things that we have touched upon in this presentation. So I will try to follow some string in my discussion. So Marianne, thank you for your intervention, for your presentation. It is a topic of great interest to me. The dynamics are ongoing in the Indo-Pacific with regards to the maritime dimension, and especially that a threshold that seems to be there in some way between what could be escalatory and what is not. And so the urge, the need for some of the actors in the region to play below that threshold. And this is, of course, of great relevance when it comes to coast guards, because, of course, coast guards are those constabulary forces that can be used to not trigger counter-reaction, escalation, but still to apply force where it is needed. And also, as you have noticed, and this is of great relevance, to pursue different objectives. And this is the first point I want to make. And if you can expand on this, there is an interjection. There is an integration between policy objectives when it comes to Coast Guard. So you have classical Coast Guard operation and activities, so maritime security, immigrations, piracy, and so on. But then you have increasingly deterrence and defense operations. And this is, I think this is related to you employing the concept of soft balancing, which was quite fashionable back in the early 2000s when it came to Russia and China. So the idea of Robert Pape of Russia and China self-balancing the United States, and still you apply it to a somehow different case. But still, and this is my criticism, if we want to put it in that way, self-balancing is, if we employ IR literature, should be directed towards a rising power because you want to maintain a status quo. And so you want to maintain a certain balance, a certain distribution of things, a certain normative order. And so you use a soft tool to exert power. And it's meant to exert deterrence. And my first question would be, do you really think that coast guards today in the Indo-Pacific are able to exert that deterrence? Or probably it is more correct to say that it is the defense military establishment behind the coast guards. So the fact that China is big, huge, large, it could intervene more assertively, that is projecting deterrence. Because I think that coast guards is in the middle of something, but it's never clear what it's doing some way. And the second question I wanted to make regards regional cooperation. This is really interesting to me. And straightforward, I would like to ask you, where do you think we are when it comes to a kind of conduct in the South China Sea and with regards to regional maritime cooperation for close encounters? So do you think we are making strides in this regard? So thank you very much. These are my two cents for what regards. Marianne, should I go with old comments, or we can stop and I don't know, whatever.
Okay.
Okay.
In fact, what is interesting in the development of the Coast Guard by littoral state, not only in fact in the Southeast Asia, but it was so emblematic because of, you see, the aggressiveness of China and the fact that China used precisely the Coast Guard in a very different way. And it, on the contrary, is using its Coast Guard as a kind of suppletive force to reinforce, in fact, its claim, and refraining to send the PLA Navy, but giving this kind of projection of power that gives the impression that we are in face of a military actor and is militarizing de facto these policing forces. So we had different view with some effort of the littoral state not to follow this trend, try to make a kind of difference between policing activities and military activity, because navies are done for war fighting. And in fact, this resistance is difficult to maintain because, in fact, the essential, I will say, concern is linked to the maritime boundaries. And in fact, you see, when you want to deal with illegal immigration, when you want to deal with drug trafficking or illegal fishing activities, you tend to stay in the sphere of policing and very standard activities. But the problem is that all of this activity, and notably illegal fishing, is really a concern which is going more with dispute over maritime boundary, because what is at stake is also exploitation of their fishery resources for the littoral state. And the problem is the Coast Guard of Philippines are not able to protect their fishermen against this strategy, you see, of reinforcing the presence of Coast Guard, or just putting in the front line fishing fleet, Chinese fishing fleets or Chinese militia, and largely behind, posting the Coast Guard in order to increase the pressure. So there is a kind of difficulty, even if the littoral state do not want to be in, I would say, in an escalatory situation, because they know perfectly that they will lose, and they will lose a lot of things. So they try to send the policing agent, but of course, these are not very, I would say, very active in front of the deployment of China. But again, this is a choice of trying to not going to a situation that will go out of control and will definitively change the statu quo. So the effort of the Coast Guard are just to keep the situation under control and not giving China any incentive to change dramatically the statu quo. So it's balancing situation which is very difficult to maintain. And the code of conduct is not helping. The code of conduct, you know, it is a new one and it's ongoing discussion since long months, because China is trying to impose some perspective already and is considering that its claim going through the 9-dash line has to be taken into consideration, and is not ready to accept that the code of conduct is not accepting already the claim.
Yeah.
So it's very, very difficult. China want to take any external actor out of the water of the South China Sea. So is trying to put some, I would say, some element as demanding an authorization for cooperation of the littoral state with external actor, which is clearly to avoid any development of oil platform with a cooperation with external agency. So he's putting a lot of things just to try to impose its view and to try to restrain the capacity of external actor to have any influence in the zone. So the code of conduct as it is actually is not acceptable for the main claimant, and is going to be, you see, under discussion, I'm afraid, for quite a long time. And I do not think that Cambodian chairmanship of the ASEAN during this last month has really the power to impose anything to China. And the QS is quite an interesting document to prevent and to try to evade any collision. And of course, is a kind of, you see, element that came from the Cold War and was a very successful agreement between the US and the Russian Navy, precisely to avoid any situation of tension. But there is no QS for Coast Guard in the South China Sea. Yeah. And from time to time, this is a request of many littoral states in order precisely to deal with this situation, or more or less you are in a situation of confrontation.
Okay, thank you. So moving to Mark's presentation. So Mark, thank you for your words and great to see you again. I will indulge a little bit more on this because it is something that I've studied myself. So a lot of great points. I will go straight forward to my first question. My own reading of the NATO 2030 document gave me this impression that we were going to see something bigger in the new strategic concept with regards to China and Asia. While the actual document in June, I feel that was like some kind of step back, probably because of course, of February 25th. So what do you think about this? Do you think that there is some kind of mismatch between the NATO 2030 document vision and so on and the NATO 2022 strategic concept? So do you think that something happened in the middle that changed the course of the concept? So this is my first point. Second point, I wrote on this, so the NATO alleged reorientation towards Asia and China. And I found out that there is, I think the United States, there is some kind of a problem with regards to enlarging NATO area of operations and area of interest for a reason of what I label a portfolio diversification thing, meaning that the United States has been working so hard in the last 5 years to build networks of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm not teaching the teacher here, Giulio Pugliese, when it comes to regional security cooperation. But right now, they have so many different layers of cooperation with so many different actors. And I would say that probably NATO is not so much needed to Washington when it comes to regional security and, of course, the containment of China in the Indo-Pacific, because there is plenty there already that can be used for that purpose. So my question on this is, what's the real value added by NATO if there is so much on the ground there already? And last thing, actually, I took so many notes on your presentation. So the Taiwan scenario that you were mentioning at the end of your presentation is really of interest. But last thing, an insights from you. So insider trading, if I may, just that. Do you think there is the motivation, the political motivation, not in the United States or in the United Kingdom, but in the Southern Europe NATO members and Eastern Europe NATO members to closer cooperation with Japan? So this is something, of course, a bit thorny, but if you can spend some words on that. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Good to see you again, and appreciate the questions. I think you're right about the discrepancy in the emphasis of global scope that was in the 2030 document compared to the final strategic document. I think the main reason is what you already mentioned. So February 2022, and what I didn't, and Ukraine, Russia, this for good reason became sort of the all-consuming subject of attention for NATO in the lead up to the strategic concept in Madrid. And given that, I was actually surprised that that as much was included from the 2030 document as appeared in the final strategic concept. So I had a slightly different perspective about that. I was expecting to see less on human security, less on climate change, and less on security developments in Asia and sort of a NATO global view. That being said, the strategic concept, and I think in a couple of the press conferences before Madrid, the SecGen and other speakers from headquarters were sort of reminding the audience that this should be a long view for NATO, and that these topics of the future should not be overshadowed by short-term, hopefully will be short-term events on the eastern flank. So I was not surprised by the imbalance. I was actually expecting to see a bit more of an imbalance. And I think the other factor to take into account is the 2030 document, although it had gone through a sort of ministerial and consultative what's the word I'm looking for? Well, although it had been scrutinized by the member states, when you actually get to the final strategic concept, I think that it went through another round of even greater scrutiny. So perhaps the strategic concept reflects also a degree of caution and consensus building in internal discussions among the allies. In terms of NATO's value add to the Indo-Pacific, maybe I didn't. Maybe this didn't come across in my presentation. I don't think that NATO will get directly involved in a military contingency in the Indo-Pacific. I don't think that NATO, as it's laid out in the strategic concept, envisages a direct role in the event of a military incursion, but there is some value add in terms of cooperation, perhaps at a slightly higher level than what already exists today. So we've talked about, it's been mentioned, joint exercises, interoperability, communication sharing. And here I should also say I expect more of the value add to be with individual allied members. So you mentioned, of course, the US, but also potentially the UK, and even France. So for some of the reasons that have been brought up in this and the previous panel. So NATO's real value add is that it offers Japan and partners in the Indo-Pacific a forum in which they can not only network but exchange ideas and begin to build plans for deeper cooperations with individual allies in the region. And with regard to your third question, let's see.
Motivation, political motivation.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I can't read my own handwriting, excuse me.
Some words from you on what is going on with the southern and eastern NATO allies when it comes to greater cooperation with Japan.
Right. That's a good point. And I think something that I didn't touch on in my presentation was the point of reciprocity and this pattern that I observe with Japan's support of Ukraine in the current war environment. So I don't think that I think that to some extent some NATO member states, particularly in the south, and also on NATO's eastern flank, that have less experience in the Indo-Pacific, yes, there would probably be you would probably need to build a case with them based on where we are today, especially where we were a year ago. But if you incorporate the events of this year and also the pattern of support that not only Japan but also other partners are showing in support of Ukraine, in support of sanctions and aid that is quite frankly costly and can be difficult to justify to the Japanese public. This is also building a case for a degree of reciprocity in the future. So Japan is proving to a certain extent its credibility as a partner to NATO in the events of this year, in such a way that I think it will not be forgotten by some of the NATO member states that you and I have in mind, particularly those on the eastern flank. It was mentioned before in one of the panels, the point about Lithuania and Lithuania as being sort of a bellwether of this realization among Eastern European NATO member states of the challenge that China poses.
Time is running pretty fast.
Yes,
I have to move to the next comment. Thank you very much. You have clarified so much of your presentation. Thank you. Last but not least, Tomoko, nice to meet you. And thank you for your great presentation. I'm not an expert into cyber and information warfare. And so your insights were really valuable for me. So I've written a bit about differences between Chinese and Russian assertiveness as a concept in when it comes to regional security. And someone pitched me the idea that Russia is conducting a more aggressive cyber posture because it's trying to disrupt, while China is more like moderate in the cyber domain and is only trying to influence. So I would like to ask you some details on the map that you showed with the numbers of on information operations, if there is also a qualitative difference, not only a quantitative difference of operation between Russia and China. This is the first point, and then I would like to expand on this. And the second one is, and probably in some way I'm contradicting myself, but probably it's not only Japan that can learn something from the Russian-Ukraine war, but probably you and NATO may learn something from Japan. Because if I look back to 2003 and the Chinese Central Military Commission guideline on the three warfares, so the idea that one of the warfare is a psychological warfare and psychological operations, then probably Japan has been subject to this kind of influence operations way longer than the European Union and NATO. So probably there could be some ground for potential cooperation, and this is also for Marco Zawa between Japan and NATO, but probably not in the direction that we could expect. So also backwards. So this is my second point. Tomoko, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So as for first question, the difference of between Russia and China's strategy, security strategy, and especially in the cyber influence operations. So mainly Russia is targeting to destroy or confuse the society or the democratic value, and they would like to their also authoritarian power to the world. But China is somehow different from the Russia. So China has a similar concept of China expansion to the Pacific Ocean or to the world. But China's influence is main point is China center thought, and so this is not so much combat or destroy the democratic value. So it is so China would like to increase their reputation or repetitive their power, but Russia is more negative. Russia is aiming more negative one. So I think this is the different concept or a different narrative based on their differences, their strategic concepts by based on the historical research, I think. And as for second one, so as you mentioned, yes, so psychological warfare has a great historical one for of the China influence operations, and we have long history of combating to China's such a strategy. So maybe we can Japanese government or Japan can share or teach some lessons for NATO, but there is some issues for Japan because due to the restriction of constitution, we have the barrier of secretary of communication and freedom of speech. So it is very difficult to gather the evidence of attributions or in the cyberspace. So it is very challenging to change the constitution. But if we can do it, we can put a lot of situation awareness of a lot of evidence of situation awareness with insight of psychological warfare based on the historical background, I think. So we have time limitation. Yes, my answer is.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor back to the chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your excellent interventions, everyone, and for your being a discussant. Lorenzo, you've all waited so patiently. I know when I go to a conference, I get really annoyed when there's no time to ask questions. So if anyone has a question, please put your hand up. Yes, Cesar. Yes? Here she comes.
Okay, thank you. Arigato gozaimasu to the Japanese speakers. Because my question is to both of them, perhaps. Well, Mark is half Japanese, I think, but okay, the two online speakers. There's a NATO consultative council that's been going on for at least 2 decades, right? And Mark had recalled that in the Madrid strategic concept, there are still some avenues of potential dialogue with Russia. So not everything is not cut right away, right, because of the Ukrainian crisis. Now, my question is, with China and the Indo-Pacific, is there any consultative mechanism within NATO, bilaterally with China or multilaterally with the SISTO, that is a Russian-led military alliance in Central Asia, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? If not, I think there is not, but that's my question. I don't know. If not, is it perhaps, and that's now for Tomoko Nagasako, is it because now we live in an information society that is precluding creating or is not in favor of creating traditional diplomatic risk reduction platforms, councils? So now all communication has become online, partly, proper information, but partly disinformation, all kinds of operations. So it's a way to connect both online speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pick up another question here. Let's keep it short and sharp because the time is very tight. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is for you, madam. Do you think that China's strategy in the South China Sea is working? You mentioned the three warfares, so do you think this intimidation is working, and also the abusing of the law, international law? And will it be enough for China to achieve its goal, or do you think that a military escalation will be needed at some point? And also in that case, when do you think it will be? And will the opponents have any chances to win, perhaps through alliances? And also how these alliances could be? Like, I think NATO would be more willing to participate through maybe like as we've seen like in Ukraine, or like also like Western powers will be involved, but like more from like a side point of view. So what do you think about it?
You got the easiest question, huh?
Yeah, indeed. Well, I'm not going to risk any perspective regarding any escalation, meaning a kind of clash within the South China Sea. There have been already clashes with some, I will say, a national initiative. I have in mind our Indonesian colleague, which was very, very pushy when it came to forbidden the access of their EEZ to fishing Chinese fishing vessel because they sank them. And it's happened at least twice. So it was quite an expeditive means, but it stopped apparently illegal fishing in the water of Indonesia close to the Natuna. But I'm afraid now China has installed a lot of artificial island. If I can speak of artificial island, I know that legal experts don't like to hear this because it's a recognition of this kind of status, and UNCLOS is not, you see, recognizing this kind of construction. Artificial island, but of course they have made a lot of you see remblaiement, and I'm afraid that now the situation is not reversible. I do not see why and how China will abandon all of the construction and the fact that they have developed some island effectively where they have deployed some radar and missile system. And so they are in a situation of having a kind of very global and interesting maritime domain awareness, and they can monitor access to the South China Sea. And I'm afraid there is nothing to do to reverse the situation. And I suppose that you have in mind the way that China welcomed the arbitration regarding the case against Philippines, saying that it is a farce and they are not going to accept anything. So according to, I will say, this situation, when the legal tools are not taken into consideration and that we had accept use of force, I'm afraid that the situation is quite at the advantage, strategically speaking, of China for now regarding its claim.
And yeah, at an earlier panel, they were talking about dual-use goods, and let's not forget it was German and Belgian dredgers that created this artificial terrain in the South China Sea. And so I think that, you know, how do you, China now built, it's technically called, I think the real title is a magical island builder. They just kind of stole the IP and they gave it this incredible name. But I think that it's really important to keep in mind, you know, this kind of tech transfer issue. And in addition, CIPRI in Sweden has documented so much of this. We've seen Germany send 21 silent diesel engines. I don't think 21 submarines are for tourists. I think that they help the People's Liberation Army Navy leapfrog. So we're seeing Europe seen as a tech piggy bank. And I think that's something really should be of great concern. And this should be important because as the US tightens export controls, China is going to work harder and harder to get the technology out of Europe, as we've seen with many spying cases. And I think that this is a real key area of cooperation. And we should also keep in mind that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, China was there at the table. You know, they were there at the negotiations, so they tend to ignore it. But I want you to finish the questions from Cesar. So the other panelists might want to address his question, Mark and Tomoko.
I'll just address the one question that I think was specifically related to NATO. Thank you for your questions. Well, you probably know that there is no institutionalized mechanism for communication between NATO and China as has existed between NATO and Russia. So there's no NATO-China Council. I've heard discussions of the possibility of a NATO-China Council, specifically during the reflection process that occurred in the lead up to the security concept, but it seemed to not really go anywhere. What I can say is that probably 3 to 4 years ago, there were some staff-to-staff level initial discussions between NATO staff officers and Chinese staff officials in Brussels. And from what I understand, the concern there, well, there were a few concerns, but I think most of the primary concern was on the Chinese side. So there was a reluctance by China. And my impression is that there is still a degree of concern on the Chinese side about NATO as a non-friendly organization. So institutionalizing any sort of bilateral mechanism, I think, would be a showstopper on the Chinese side. That being said, the communications have risen up to a higher level over the last year. And so you might also know that the Chinese foreign minister did meet with the Secretary General during the UN Assembly opening. And there is a sense that greater communication will be fruitful, but on an informal ad hoc basis for the time being. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Tomoko?
May I?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for interesting questions. So as the question mentioned, yes, we live in the digital age, and we communicate almost in online. So it is very challenging to combat disinformation and information warfare. But there are three important points to combat disinformation, I believe. So making a strong national security strategy and doing fact check and enhance digital literacy. So first one, for example, as for Japanese government, Japanese government is modifying the national security strategy to include the concept of countermeasure of information warfare this year. So, and if the government or if the nation makes a strong security strategy for information warfare, it is easy to legislate the control or regulate platform or social networking service. And as for fact check, it is a great successful example of NATO. So NATO released in 2015, just after the crisis of Crimea, they started East-Stratcom and started the fact check website EU versus Disinfo. So it is great example, and the Japanese government should learn the lessons of these great fact-checking sites. And last point, enhancing digital literacy. So in this point, I believe not only the countermeasure by government, but also we can make effort to combat disinformation by ourselves, each other. So it is important to enhance the critical thinking or logical thinking when you use social networking service, and enhancing digital literacy. It is also the human resource exchange internationally or networking, especially for the political leaders, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'm glad you gave EU versus disinfo a shout out, because I think that's a great resource for all of you here. Look at the website or follow them on Twitter. I just want to thank the panelists for the rich discussion. I want to compliment Giulio for the prescience of to have this event scheduled right after the conclusion of the Chinese Communist Party 20th Party Congress. I'm sure that wasn't on the agenda when you set this event up, but it was really perfectly timed. And we see that power is further centralized under Xi Jinping, and he appears to have surrounded himself with loyal yes men. We know what happens when that, we saw that with Putin. So this is, I think, a very worrying situation. He's clearly more ideologically driven rather than by the economy. And China's slowing economic growth, I think, is a worrying red flag. It's at 3.9%. It's far lower than the 5% that need to keep everyone calm and avoid social unrest. The Chinese renminbi is down at 14-year low. Stocks down, Hong Kong 10% down, Shanghai 6%. So we know in history this is not a good recipe. But this conference has shown us that there's growing strategic convergence in this triangle: NATO's strategic concept, US national security strategy, and the EU strategic compass, as well as Shinzo Abe's contribution of the Indo-Pacific. Mark Ozawa highlighted, and I was really happy to hear this, that EU is NATO's primary institutional partner. Those are great words. Yay! So just to, Biden described, the US national security strategy stated that the PRC presents the US with the most consequential geopolitical challenge. And President Biden described it as a contest for the future of our world. The global West, as we can see from today's event, is defined more by ideas than actual geography, as we see with the triangulation between the EU, Japan, and NATO. The Indo-Pacific used to be a taboo word in Brussels. I was invited to an event in Japan. I came back. I wanted to give a big conference about the Indo-Pacific. And at the last minute, I won't say their names, but two high-level EU officials canceled on me because they weren't allowed to attend anything that said Indo-Pacific. So now we are talking about Indo-Pacific. It's a common phrase now that we are allowed to use. And that really highlights Shinzo Abe's contribution. That's going to last, I think. And we've seen with the French presidency, there's some consistency with the EU rotating council presidency. They highlighted the Indo-Pacific. Czech Republic is a landlocked country. They are focusing on the Indo-Pacific. So we're seeing, that this is really getting some traction. And I think that's really important. There is the elephant in the room here about potential growing fragmentation inside the EU. We know about the 16+1, the sub-regional grouping of 11 EU member states, 5 possible accession states. It might become cheaper by the dozen. In February, 2 more EU member states are talking about leaving. Lithuania was the first to leave, followed by Estonia and Latvia. So that could be 12 plus 1. So China has probably learned a lesson never to call any organization by a number, because it becomes a barometer of how they're doing. And threat perception really depends on where you sit in Europe. And we're seeing this bifurcation within the EU of Central Eastern European member states, along with the Balts, having really concerns about Russia and China, whereas other member states aren't so concerned. So I think that this is another possible divide that China can drive a wedge in. Speaking of wedges, we're seeing German Chancellor Scholz flying to Beijing on November 3rd and 4th. There was a lot of rumors circulating around Brussels about how they wanted it to be an EU thing, but he's kind of reinventing the Sinatra doctrine. He's doing it his way, and his relations with China. So it's a German way, not the EU way. So I do also want to emphasize that, the EU, geopolitics was also a taboo word. And now we have a conference on triangularization. And so we've really seen an evolution within EU and their views on how the world has changed and is evolving over time. And history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So have lessons been learned about overdependency on Russian energy? I would suggest certain member states don't see that. Decoupling is a taboo word in Brussels as well. So we're seeing kind of a strategic, the US is trying to promote strategic decoupling in key sectors. Maybe this is something that should be explored further. Chancellor Scholz, sorry to pick on him, but I mean, he said there's no such thing as decoupling. He's really promoting. And there's a great deal of concern. We haven't really talked about this during this conference, but this is something maybe to think about. NATO and EU really need each other so much because China's penetration of the markets within the EU and in strategic infrastructure like ports, electric grids, the commanding heights of the economy, that can, turn into economic coercion. And so I think the EU, that's their realm, the economy, and NATO needs to kind of have better communication with the EU. So the EU has come up with toolbox for certain things, but I think that there needs to be a great deal more communication on all of this. And, we're seeing the Hamburg port. China wants to invest there with COSCO. It will be, Italy, as you know, has many investments from China in their port infrastructure. And so, this is also a sign of talent spotting because let's not forget that Scholz was a mayor there. And I'm sure the Chinese wined and dined him, invited him to China and gave him a teapot and things like that. So there's this idea of elite capture and how that, they can talent spot, find people who might move up into the government. And I think that might pay off for China. So there's one thing that I love, and I usually conclude a lot of my talks with this, as Giulio said. Oh, well, let me just say this. The war in Ukraine has reminded us that we must imagine the unimaginable. Last year at the Munich Security Conference, no one wanted to imagine that a war would take place in Ukraine, and it happened just days after the conference concluded. So the best minds in defense were there. The US was kind of saying, hey, look, we've got this intelligence. It doesn't look good. And everyone's like, oh my God, I can't believe it happened. So I think we really have to pay attention. Possibility of a two-front war, sadly, is real. I know no one likes to think about that, but we have to think about that. China has hypersonic technology, underwater drones. It might be a very, very different type of war, not like World War II ships firing and things like that. And the key question about Russia-China coordination. China, in my view, will keep Russia in the tent. If there's a war, God forbid, they want Russia with them and not maybe moving over to the US. So as Giulio has said, and I quote Benjamin Franklin, we must hang together or certainly we will all hang separately. Thank you so much for all of your attention and sticking around until a little after 6. So thank you so much. And a big round of applause for all the excellent contributions by our panelists.